The morning they tried to hang Duke Cadric Thornhart, the gallows collapsed. Not from divine intervention or rotten wood, but because 20 men hauled on the rope simultaneously, their combined weight shattering the crossbeam before his neck could snap. He stood there in the wreckage, iron shackles dark against his wrists, staring at the crowd with eyes cold as winter stone while broken timber smoked around his boots. The executioner stammered an apology. The nobles who'd orchestrated his arrest shifted uncomfortably on their velvet cushions, and Cadric smiled, a razor-thin expression that promised none of them would live to see another dawn. This is where power meets consequence, where mercy dies screaming, and where one man's fall becomes everyone else's funeral. Stay with me through blood and betrayal, because what comes next will redefine everything you thought you knew about survival. And I promise you, by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why some men are too dangerous to kill and too broken to save. The collapse bought him 6 hours. 6 hours while the royal engineers rebuilt the gallows under armed guard, while nobles argued jurisdiction in marble halls, while servants whispered prayers behind kitchen doors. 6 hours chained in a stone cell beneath the capital's courthouse, watching dust motes drift through the single-barred window, calculating probabilities with the methodical precision that had once made him the most feared military commander in 3 kingdoms. Cadric Thornhart had built his reputation on numbers that didn't lie. Casualty projections, supply line vulnerabilities, the exact psychological breaking point where loyalty transformed into terror. He'd won 17 campaigns before his 30th birthday, not through heroism or divine favor, but through understanding that war was mathematics written in blood, and the side willing to solve for X with the most corpses generally won. The cell door opened without ceremony. Captain Rice Malkin entered, uniform crisp despite the summer heat, carrying a wooden stool and a leather satchel. He set the stool carefully outside the reach of Cadric's chains, then sat with the practiced ease of a man who'd conducted 1,000 interrogations. They'd served together in the northern campaigns. Reese had been a lieutenant then, green and idealistic, convinced military glory meant something beyond the efficient distribution of violence. Cadric had cured him of that notion during the siege of Harrogate. Now Rice opened the satchel and withdrew a sheaf of documents, handling them like contaminated material. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat professional tone of someone reading prepared testimony at a funeral. Treason against the crown, conspiracy to overthrow legitimate government, unauthorized military action resulting in civilian casualties. The list continued for 3 full pages, each charge documented with dates, locations, witness statements. Cadric listened without interruption, watching a spider construct its web in the corner where stone met ceiling. The spider worked with admirable efficiency, no wasted movement, pure function. "You already know all this," Cadric said when Reese finished. His voice hadn't changed in 6 hours of silence. Still carried that aristocratic polish his tutors had beaten into him as a child, back when the Thornhart name meant something beyond military tribunals and execution warrants. So why perform the recitation? Rice set the documents aside. Protocol. Also wanted to see if you'd defend yourself. Against truth? Cadric's smile returned mirthless. I authorized the assault on Ravenholm. Planned it myself, actually. Every detail, from the artillery placement to the civilian evacuation routes, we deliberately left unguarded. The fire wasn't collateral damage. It was tactical necessity. The capital called it genocide. 300 dead in a single night. Women, children. Elderly refugees who'd fled the fighting only to burn when Thornhart's cavalry torched the southern district. The broadsheets had been screaming about it for weeks, printing woodcut illustrations of flames consuming innocent faces while a dark figure on horseback watched from the hills. They'd gotten the horse wrong. Cadric rode a gray mare named Arithmetic, not the black destroyer their propaganda required. Details mattered, even in atrocity. Reese leaned forward, elbows on knees. You could have taken the city without the fire. We both know it. You had numerical superiority, better positioning, control of the water supply. So why? Because Ravenholm was financing rebel operations across 4 provinces. Cadric's tone didn't shift, discussing mass murder with the same clinical detachment he'd used describing weather patterns. Their guild networks were funneling gold to insurgent cells faster than we could track it. Occupying the city would have required a garrison of 2,000 men tied down for years, while the funding continued through underground channels. The fire solved a logistical problem. It murdered children. It saved soldiers. Kedrick met Reese's stare without flinching. My soldiers, men with families of their own who would have died slowly in street fighting, while Ravenholm's merchants counted profits and pretended neutrality. I chose the mathematics that kept my people alive. Silence filled the cell like smoke. Above them, hammers rang against wood as workers rebuilt the instrument of Kedrick's execution. The sound echoed through stone, rhythmic and inevitable. Reese's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke again. You used to be different. Back in the northern campaigns, you gave quarter, accepted surrenders. Hell, you personally negotiated the treaty at Milford that saved half their population from starvation. That was before I understood how the world actually functions. Kedrick shifted position, chains rattling. Milford rebelled again 3 years later. Killed the garrison I'd left to protect them and opened their gates to Valdris raiders. Every man I'd saved during the treaty died screaming while his family watched. Mercy is a luxury purchased with other people's blood, Rice. I stopped making that transaction. So this is pragmatism. The bitterness in Reese's voice cut through professional composure. Burning innocence because it's efficient? Innocence is a fiction we tell ourselves so we can sleep. Kedrick's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something wounded and vicious in equal measure. Every person in Ravenholm made choices. The merchant who sold grain to rebels chose profit over neutrality. The mother who hid insurgent correspondence chose ideology over her children's safety. The priest who blessed weapons in his sanctuary chose his version of righteousness over peace. They all chose Reese. I simply ensured their choices had consequences. The hammer blows above continued their metronomic count. Rice stood abruptly, stool scraping against stone. The tribunal convenes at sunset. They'll ask if you have anything to say before sentence. Tell them I have calculations. Kedrick's smile widened fractionally. 17 nobles voted for my arrest. I've had 6 hours to review their financial records, family connections, political vulnerabilities. Every man who sits in judgment knows I could destroy 3 dynasties with a single letter to the right people. They'll hang me anyway, of course, because I'm too dangerous to leave alive. But they'll spend every remaining day wondering which of their secrets I've already distributed as insurance. That's not a defense. That's terrorism. No, Kedrick said quietly. That's politics. The only difference between terrorism and statecraft is who holds the pen when history gets written. Reese gathered his documents, hands moving with barely controlled violence. You know what the worst part is? You're probably right about the mathematics, the necessity, all of it. And that's exactly why they're going to kill you. Not for being wrong, but for being too fucking honest about what power actually requires. He left without another word, door slamming with finality. Kedrick returned his attention to the spider. It had finished the web's outer framework and was working inward, creating concentric circles with methodical precision. Beautiful, really. The way pure function could achieve perfect form. The afternoon light shifted gradually through the window, marking hours in increments of shadow and dust. Kedrick didn't move except to breathe. He'd learned stillness during his first command, during the 3-day siege where moving meant dying and patience meant survival. The body could be trained to accept discomfort as baseline existence. Pain was just another variable to solve for. Around 4 o'clock, the door opened again. The woman who entered wore traveling clothes still dusty from the road, dark hair bound in a practical braid, carrying herself with the controlled grace of someone who'd survived multiple attempts on her life. Kedrick recognized her immediately despite not having seen her in 7 years. Lady Seraphine Corvath, daughter of House Corvath, sole surviving heir after the purge of the Western holdings, and according to court gossip, the most dangerous political operator currently breathing, also his former fiancée, back when such arrangements still meant something beyond asset consolidation. She studied him for a long moment before speaking, gray eyes cataloging details with the same analytical precision he'd use assessing enemy fortifications. You look terrible. You look alive. Kedrick kept his tone neutral. I'd heard rumors about House Corvath's restoration. Congratulations on surviving your family's annihilation. Her smile could have cut glass. I learned from the best. How many tutors did you assign me during our engagement? 3? 4? All of them experts in the strategic value of appearing harmless while consolidating actual power. 5 tutors. And you were an excellent student. Kedrick shifted position. chains scraping. Though I notice you're here without an armed escort, which suggests either supreme confidence or elaborate stupidity. The courthouse is controlled by families who'd benefit considerably from another Korvath corpse, or I paid the right guards. Seraphine moved closer, still maintaining distance beyond his reach. Your paranoia is showing, Kadric. Not everyone operates through violence and threat calculation. No, he agreed. Just everyone who survives long enough to matter. She laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. There's the man I remember. Tell me something. Does it ever exhaust you? Viewing every interaction as potential warfare. Calculating betrayals before they happen? Living in a world where trust is just exploitable vulnerability every single day. The admission emerged without his permission, raw and unguarded, in a way Kadric hadn't allowed himself in years. But exhaustion doesn't change mathematics. The world functions through power and its application. People who pretend otherwise just die with prettier illusions. Seraphine's expression softened fractionally, something almost like sympathy crossing her features before professional composure reasserted itself. She reached into her coat and withdrew a sealed letter, setting it on the floor where his chains could reach. From Duke Malthus. She watched him process the name. He's offering intervention. Political leverage with the tribunal, transportation to neutral territory, full pardon in exchange for military consultation on the eastern border situation. Kadric didn't touch the letter. What does he actually want? Your strategic mind without your moral complications. Seraphine's tone carried no judgment, just statement of fact. Malthus needs someone who can solve the Carthian invasion through efficient mathematics. You'd be his attack dog, properly leashed this time. And you're the messenger because I convinced him I'm the only person you might actually listen to. Her smile returned sad and knowing. Because despite everything that happened between us, despite the engagement ending and House Korvath nearly falling, I still understand how you think. And I'm telling you right now, Kadric, that letter is poison. Malthus will use you until the crisis passes, then arrange an accident. You'll die anyway, just slower and more useful. Then why deliver it? Professional courtesy. Seraphine met his gaze directly. Also wanted to see if you'd actually consider it. If there's anything left of the man who once believed duty meant more than efficient slaughter. Kadric looked at the letter, then back at her. That man died at Milford, buried in an unmarked grave along with every soldier whose mercy killed. What's left is just calculation and consequence. Bullshit! The word cracked through the cell like a whip. You want me to believe the great Duke Thornheart is just a mathematical engine? That Ravenholm was pure logic without rage or grief driving it? She moved closer, close enough now that he could smell road dust and leather. I read the reports, Kadric. All of them, including the ones they're not using at trial. What reports? The ones documenting how you personally evacuated the Eastern Quarter before the fire. How you pulled 16 families out through the trade tunnels, gave them horses and gold, sent them north with forged documents. She crouched now, eye level, forcing him to hold her stare. You burned Ravenholm, but you saved everyone you could reach first. That's not efficiency. That's someone who still gives a damn, trying desperately to pretend they don't. Tactical preservation of useful assets. Kedric's voice had gone flat, defensive. Those families included craftsmen, engineers, merchants with valuable intelligence. Basic resource management. You gave them your mother's jewelry. Seraphine pulled a silver chain from her pocket, a familiar pendant spinning in the dusty light. A blacksmith's daughter is wearing the Thornheart family crest around her neck in a northern settlement, Kadric. She told me a burned man with noble speech pressed it into her hands and told her to sell it if she needed to. Said she didn't understand why until she saw your face in the broadsheets. The silence stretched taut between them. Kadric stared at the pendant, memory flooding back unwanted. His mother standing in Thornheart Manor's garden, that same silver-catching sunlight, explaining that true nobility wasn't birth or title, but choosing to bear the weight of hard decisions so others wouldn't have to. She'd died believing that, died thinking her son would honor the responsibility their name carried. He'd burned her illusions along with Ravenholm. Keep it, he said finally, or sell it, doesn't matter now. It matters to her. Seraphine's intensity hadn't diminished. It matters to the 16 families who survived because you couldn't quite kill the part of yourself that still believes people are worth saving. And it matters to me because I came here with a genuine offer, not Malthus's poison. Kadric's attention sharpened. What offer? Testimony. Seraphine straightened, returning the pendant to her pocket. I have documentation proving Ravenholm's guild networks were funding more than rebel operations. They were financing slave networks, coordinating with foreign intelligence, planning coordinated strikes against civilian targets across 5 kingdoms. The Crown knows this. They've known for months. But using the information publicly would expose how compromised their own intelligence apparatus is. So they let me burn the city and take the blame. Kedrick's laugh was bitter. Efficient. The tribunal executes a monster. The actual conspiracy dies with Ravenholm's records. Everyone wins except the people who thought they were doing the right thing. I can force disclosure. Seraphine's voice carried absolute certainty. I have copies of the Crown's intelligence reports. Original documentation proving they authorized your campaign, then retroactively criminalized it when the political winds shifted. Present that to the tribunal and they'll have to choose between executing you or admitting the Crown itself ordered what they're calling genocide. Why would you do that? Because 7 years ago you taught me that survival requires understanding who actually holds power and why. She moved toward the door, hand on the frame. Because House Korvoth exists today because you spent political capital protecting us when the Purge came, and because I'm tired of watching good people destroy themselves, trying to do necessary things in a world that punishes necessity. I'm not good people, Seraphine. No. Her smile was genuine this time, warm and terrible in equal measure. You're what good people become when they're competent enough to survive their own principles. That's infinitely more dangerous and considerably more valuable. She left him the pendant and departed without ceremony. Kedrick sat alone with his thoughts and the fading light. The spider had completed its web, perfect geometric precision spanning the corner in concentric circles. It settled in the center now, waiting with infinite patience for prey to stumble into its mathematics. Above, the hammering had stopped. The gallows were complete. He picked up Malthus's letter with shackled hands and broke the seal. The offer was exactly what Seraphine had described, elegantly written and absolutely lethal. Service in exchange for survival, with poison embedded in every clause. Duke Thornheart, the letter began, your skills remain necessary despite recent complications. The eastern border situation requires a certain moral flexibility that your recent actions demonstrate you possess in abundance. Moral flexibility. Polite language for someone willing to burn cities when the mathematics demanded it. Kedrick tore the letter into precise strips, then wove them into a small twisted rope. The motion was meditative, hands working while his mind calculated probabilities. Seraphine's offer was legitimate. He could read the truth in how she'd delivered it, the careful way she'd presented information without manipulation. She was gambling her own political capital on forcing transparency, which meant she believed the documentation was solid enough to survive scrutiny. But accepting help meant acknowledging he wanted to survive, meant admitting that 6 hours chained in stone contemplating extinction had revealed something uncomfortable about his own calculations. He'd built a life around the premise that personal survival mattered less than strategic outcomes, had convinced himself that dying meant nothing as long as the mathematics continued functioning without him. Except the mathematics never functioned alone. Someone had to run the numbers, make the choices, bear the weight of consequences. And if he died today, the next person wielding power would have to solve the same impossible equations with the same terrible answers. Only they might not save 16 families first, might not agonize over every civilian casualty, even while ordering the fire, might not understand that necessary evil still required acknowledging the evil part. The cell door opened a third time. Race entered again, but his expression had changed. Something urgent had replaced professional detachment. We need to talk. He moved quickly, checking the corridor before closing the door. About what happens if you survive the night. Kedrick set aside his paper rope. If? Lady Korvath submitted formal testimony an hour ago. Reese's voice was low, rapid. Documentation proving Crown authorization for Ravenholm. Intelligence proving the city was a legitimate military target. Everything needed to turn your trial into a referendum on royal authority. The tribunal is in chaos. Half want to proceed anyway, execute you before the political implications fully surface. The other half are terrified of what happens when the documentation goes public. And which half are you? Neither. Rice crouched, meeting him eye level the way Seraphine had. I'm the half that spent 3 years watching you make impossible decisions in the northern campaigns. watching you choose which villages to save and which to sacrifice because we never had enough resources for both. You weren't a monster then, Kadric. You were just the only person willing to acknowledge that someone had to choose, and choices required consequences. Past tense noted. Kadric kept his expression neutral. What am I now? Dangerous. Rhys's honesty was brutal. Ravenholm crossed lines. I'm not sure should be crossed, no matter how sound the strategic justification. But you're also the only military mind in 3 kingdoms capable of solving the problems no one else wants to acknowledge exist. So what happens if I survive? Civil war, probably. The admission came quietly, weighted with dread. The Crown can't allow public documentation of their authorization without losing authority. The nobles can't execute you if doing so makes them complicit in royal deception. And the people won't accept either truth, that their leaders ordered genocide, or that it was somehow justified. The whole system is balanced on lies that only function when everyone agrees to believe them. And I'm the evidence that makes the lies stop working. Kadric understood immediately. Executing me preserves the fiction. Pardoning me exposes the reality. Either way, something breaks. Rhys nodded slowly. So I need to know, if you walk out of here alive, what are you going to do? Will you be the weapon Malthus wants? The martyr Corvath is creating? Or something else entirely? Kadric thought about the spider and its perfect web. About mathematics that didn't care about comfort or morality, only function and outcome. About 16 families carrying his mother's jewelry, north, and the 300 who'd burned because he'd made a choice and owned its consequences. About whether redemption was possible when you'd already crossed every line that mattered, or if the only remaining option was to cross them consciously, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost. I'm going to tell this truth, he said finally, about what power requires, about the mathematics of violence, about how nations maintain themselves through necessary evil and comfortable ignorance. I'm going to make everyone as uncomfortable with reality as I've become. That's not an answer. Rhys's frustration broke through. That's a suicide by publicity. You'll destabilize everything. Make yourself a target from every direction. Yes. Kadric's smile returned, sharp and honest. But they'll have to acknowledge what they're killing this time. No more pretending I'm a unique monster instead of just the most honest one. Rhys stood, tension vibrating through his frame. You're going to burn the whole kingdom down around you. Only if they try to stop me from speaking. Kadric met his old comrade's stare. But that's their choice, not mine. I'm done making decisions for people who want power without acknowledging its price. The hammering had stopped hours ago. Outside the window, dusk was painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. Rhys left without another word. Kadric returned to his contemplation of the web and the waiting spider. Somewhere in the courthouse above, nobles were arguing his fate while guards rebuilt instruments of execution, and Seraphine's documentation circulated through chambers like wildfire through dry timber. The mathematics were changing. Variables he'd considered fixed were shifting into quantum states where multiple outcomes existed simultaneously. He might die tonight. He might survive. He might become something worse than either option. A living reminder that civilization's foundation was violence organized efficiently enough that people could pretend it wasn't violence at all. The door opened once more as full dark settled outside. This time they came with armed guards, tribunal officials, and irons heavy enough to restrain someone they genuinely feared. Kadric stood without resistance, allowing them to exchange his cell chains for transport restraints, feeling the weight settle across his shoulders like familiar armor. Lord Thornhart, the senior official began, voice carefully neutral. The tribunal has reached a preliminary decision pending final testimony. You are to be brought before the full assembly for questioning, not execution? Kadric kept his tone conversational. How disappointing. I'd written such an excellent final speech. The official's expression remained professionally blank, but sweat beaded his forehead. The situation has developed complications. They moved through stone corridors lit by torchlight, boots echoing in rhythm with Kadric's thoughts. Guards flanked him with weapons drawn but not quite pointed. Men who understood they were escorting something that couldn't be fully controlled, only temporarily contained. The tribunal hall was exactly as Kadric had calculated it would be. Vaulted ceiling stretching upward into shadow. Long table of carved oak where 17 nobles sat in judgment, their faces masks of aristocratic composure covering panic and calculation in equal measure. Gallery packed with observers, witnesses, political operatives, all watching to see how power would resolve its own contradictions. Seraphine sat in the front row, perfectly composed, gray eyes tracking every detail. Reese stood with the military contingent, expression unreadable. And at the center of the high table, Lord Chancellor Weimar regarded Kaedric with the cold assessment of a man who'd built his career on making problems disappear efficiently. Duke Thornhart. Weimar's voice carried theatrical gravity. You stand accused of treason, unauthorized military action, and crimes against civilian populations. How do you answer these charges? Kaedric stood straight despite the irons, meeting each noble's gaze in turn before responding. Guilty. With detailed documentation proving every decision was tactically sound, strategically necessary, and personally authorized by Crown intelligence before being retroactively criminalized for political convenience. Next question. The gallery erupted in chaos, voices rising in shock and rage, and desperate attempts at control. Weimar hammered for order while guards moved to suppress the disturbance. Through it all, Kaedric remained perfectly still, watching the mathematics of power consume itself in real time. You have no such documentation, Weimar said when order returned, but uncertainty had crept into his certainty. Lady Corvath does. Kaedric's smile was a razor cutting through pretense. Along with the original intelligence reports the Crown buried, the operational authorizations. The communications proving every action I took in Ravenholm was not only approved, but specifically requested by agencies that now claim ignorance. This is absurd. Lord Mathers stood, his face flushed with rage or fear, both fueling identical volume. You expect us to believe the Crown itself ordered civilian massacres? I expect you to believe what evidence demonstrates. Kaedric's tone never shifted from conversational reason. I expect you to acknowledge that the same system protecting your estates and trade routes requires occasional violence organized efficiently enough that you can pretend it isn't happening. I expect you to stop being shocked that someone finally spoke the mathematics aloud. Seraphine rose smoothly, moving to the presentation space with documents that looked official enough to end dynasties. With the tribunal's permission, I'd like to submit Crown Intelligence Report 774, dated 3 months before the Ravenholm incident. Denied. Weimar's voice cracked like a whip. This tribunal will not entertain conspiracy theories designed to deflect legitimate prosecution. Then I'll submit it to the broadsheets. Seraphine's smile could have frozen oceans, along with documentation proving how this tribunal was specifically convened to eliminate a politically inconvenient truth-teller before he could expose Crown involvement in activities that make Ravenholm look like gentle restraint. You wouldn't dare. But Mather's bravado was transparent fiction. Watch me. Seraphine placed the documents on the table with deliberate precision. Or you could acknowledge reality and deal with its implications honestly for once in your careers. The silence that followed was profound. Kaedric watched nobles perform rapid calculations, weighing political survival against moral convenience, wondering which variables they'd prioritize when both options led to uncomfortable destinations. This was the moment everything crystallized, where power's contradictions became too obvious to ignore. Weimar spoke slowly, each word measured with legal precision. If such documentation exists and proves Crown authorization, this tribunal lacks jurisdiction to judge actions taken under legitimate command authority. Considerable ifs, Lord Chancellor. Seraphine's tone was silk over steel, easily resolved through transparent examination of evidence, which would require exposing classified intelligence operations. Another noble interjected, Lord Kestris, younger than most and clearly terrified of the implications, potentially destabilizing international relations, compromising active networks, undermining public trust in governance itself. As opposed to executing a duke for following orders? Seraphine's laugh was sharp. Yes, let's definitely prioritize comfortable lies over functional government. That's worked so well historically. Kaedric had remained silent during the exchange, watching layers of pretense strip away as smart people confronted the structural impossibility of their position. Now he spoke, voice cutting through the mounting chaos with clinical precision. Here's what's actually happening. The Crown authorized Ravenholm through back channels because public approval would have required acknowledging the slave networks, foreign intelligence, and coordinated terrorist operations those guilds were financing. I executed the operation because someone had to, and I was competent enough to do it efficiently. The fire killed 300 people, which is tragic, but considerably better than the thousands who would have died if those networks remained operational. Pues, he paused, letting the mathematics settle in their minds. Now you have three options. Execute me and hope Corvath's documentation disappears with me, which it won't because she's already distributed copies to people who'd benefit from your embarrassment. Pardon me, and admit the Crown Order's necessary evils while maintaining comfortable public ignorance, which destroys your political authority. Or create a middle path where someone pays the price for Ravenholm while the truth remains strategically obscured. What middle path? Vamar's tone suggested he'd already calculated the answer and hated it. Exile. Kadric delivered it without inflection. Strip my titles, confiscate my holdings, banish me beyond the kingdom's borders. I become the monster who exceeded authority while the crown maintains deniability. Everyone gets to feel morally superior while the actual mathematics of power continue functioning exactly as before. That's not justice. Rice's voice emerged from the military section, strained with frustration. That's theatrical cowardice. No, Kadric corrected. That's politics. Justice is a narrative we construct to make power feel legitimate. This tribunal was never about determining truth, only about resolving political complications in whatever way preserves existing structures. Another silence, deeper now, waited with the exhaustion of people confronting truths they'd rather ignore. Vamar looked at his fellow judges, silent communication flowing through meaningful glances and minute gestures. Then he returned his attention to Kaedric with something almost like respect beneath the professional hostility. The tribunal will adjourn for deliberation. Guards, return the accused to holding. They moved to escort him from the hall, but Kaedric remained rooted, chain scraping as he turned to address the entire assembly. One more thing before you deliberate. His voice carried to every corner, cutting through whispers and calculation. Whatever you decide about my fate, understand this. I'm not an aberration. I'm what happens when competent people actually acknowledge what governance requires. Every noble in this room has blood on their hands, from policies that demand violence and exploitation to maintain your comfort. The only difference is I stopped pretending the mathematics were someone else's responsibility. He met Seraphine's gaze across the chamber, something unspoken passing between them. So when you execute me or exile me or whatever compromise lets you sleep tonight, remember that someone else will have to make the choices I made. And they might not agonize over them first. They might not save 16 families or lose sleep calculating whether 300 deaths were truly necessary or just convenient. They might just be efficient without the complications of residual conscience. Then he allowed the guards to lead him away, leaving nobles to contemplate exactly what kind of monster they were creating by eliminating the one willing to admit monstrosity existed. Back in the cell, Kadric discovered someone had left fresh water and bread. Small mercy or bureaucratic procedure, he couldn't determine which. The spider's web remained intact, trembling slightly in the draft from the corridor. He sat against the wall and waited. The hours stretched like pulled wire, taut with possibility and dread in equal measure. Outside, the city continued functioning, markets trading, taverns serving, people living lives built on foundations they'd rather not examine too closely. Somewhere the tribunal argued his fate while weighing political survival against abstract principles. Kedrick found himself thinking about his mother's garden again, unwanted memories surfacing through disciplined detachment. She'd grown roses there, varieties bred for perfection that required constant maintenance and protection from the elements. Beautiful, fragile, demanding resources that could have been allocated to more practical concerns. He'd asked her once why she bothered with something so inefficient. Because beauty and meaning don't require efficiency to matter, she'd answered, pruning thorns with gentle precision. Because the world needs people who maintain expensive, impractical things just to prove we're more than calculating machines. She'd been wrong, of course. The world had consumed her kindness and continued functioning exactly as before, maybe worse now that one source of irrational beauty had been removed from the equation. But he still remembered the roses. Still caught himself calculating whether 16 families and one blacksmith's daughter, wearing his mother's jewelry, added up to something that mattered beyond pure tactical value. Still wondered if the part of himself that had saved them was weakness, or the last remaining fragment of whatever had made him human before the mathematics took over completely. The door opened near midnight. Seraphine entered alone, moving with practiced silence. She carried wine and actual glasses, anachronistic elegance in a stone cell that smelled of old violence. Verdict came through. She poured without asking permission, handing him a glass through the bars. Exile, as you calculated. Stripped of title and property, banished beyond the northern border with orders never to return on pain of death. Kedrick accepted the wine, noting its quality. Someone had spent actual money on this. When? Dawn. Seraphine settled against the opposite wall, close enough for conversation, but respecting the distance his chains enforced. They're moving fast before documentation can spread further. You'll be escorted to the border by Crown Guard, then released with whatever supplies they're legally required to provide condemned nobility. Which is a horse, basic provisions, and your personal effects minus anything valuable enough to fund a return. Her smile was tired. Essentially, they're dumping you in the wilderness with a strong suggestion to die quietly. Thoughtful of them. Kedrick sipped the wine, letting its warmth cut through the cell's perpetual chill. And you? What's your role in this resolution? Officially? Seraphine's gray eyes reflected torchlight, turning them amber and dangerous. I'm being praised for my commitment to justice, tempered with mercy. Unofficially, every noble in that tribunal knows I forced their hand, and they're terrified of what else I might expose if they move against me. Mutually assured destruction, classic strategy, learned from the best. She raised her glass in mock salute. To exiled dukes and uncomfortable truths, to survival through threat calculation. They drank in silence, two people who understood exactly how broken the machinery of power actually was, and how little that understanding changed the necessity of engaging with it. Seraphine spoke again after several moments. I have something for you. She produced a leather case from her coat, setting it within his reach. Letters of introduction to settlements beyond the northern border. Places where your reputation might actually be an asset instead of a death sentence. Mercenary companies that value strategic thinking over moral purity. You're assuming I want to continue. Kedrick examined the case without opening it. Maybe exile is where I stop calculating and let the mathematics function without me. Bullshit. The word was gentle, but absolute. You're going to survive because that's what you do. Because someone has to understand how power actually works, and you're too competent to waste yourself on philosophical surrender. And because despite everything, I think you still believe the world needs people willing to bear the weight of necessary evil consciously, instead of inflicting it through comfortable ignorance. He opened the case. Inside were documents, maps, letters stamped with seals from organizations he recognized and several he didn't. Careful preparation representing hours of work and significant political capital. Why? The question emerged simpler than he'd intended. Why spend resources on someone the kingdom just condemned? Seraphine met his gaze directly. Because 7 years ago you taught me that survival requires understanding who holds power and why. Because you protected House Korvath when you had no political reason to. And because I genuinely believe the world is worse when competent people destroy themselves trying to do impossible things in systems designed to punish competence. Plus you're useful, Kedrick added. Dangerous, informed, capable of destabilizing structures if I choose to. Keeping me alive and obligated is smart long-term strategy. That too. She didn't deny it, which he appreciated. Honesty between practitioners of violence was rare enough to value. But it's not just calculation, Kedrick. I actually give a damn about what happens to you. Sentiment is inefficient. So is giving your mother's jewelry to a blacksmith's daughter. Seraphine's smile was knowing and sad. You can pretend you're pure mathematics all you want. I've seen the evidence otherwise. They finished the wine as midnight deepened into the small hours before dawn. Speaking occasionally, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, two people who'd chosen to engage with power's contradictions instead of pretending they didn't exist. Eventually, Seraphine stood, collecting the glasses. The guards will come at first light. She moved toward the door, then paused. One last thing. The families you evacuated from Ravenholm, they're organizing, building settlements, creating networks, staying connected. They call themselves the Thornheart Refugees, which is either darkly ironic or surprisingly touching, depending on how you interpret it. What do they want? To make sure you know that 300 people died, but 16 families survived because someone powerful enough to burn cities still chose to save who they could reach. Her expression was fierce and gentle simultaneously. To make sure you understand that choices matter even when all options are terrible. That calculation without conscience is just efficient evil, but conscience without calculation is useless virtue. She left him with that, door closing with hollow finality. Kaedric sat alone in the darkness, thinking about mathematics and meaning, efficiency and beauty, the roses in his mother's garden, and the web in the corner of his cell. The spider had caught something while he wasn't watching. Small insects struggling against silk, movements growing weaker as the predator approached with methodical patience. Pure function executing its programming without malice or mercy. He wondered if that's what he'd become. If years of choosing between impossible options had finally calcified him into something that operated without the complications of residual humanity. If the part of himself that still agonized over 16 families versus 300 dead was weakness, to be eliminated or the last thread preventing him from becoming exactly what the tribunal feared. Dawn arrived with brutal efficiency. Guards came with travel chains and escort protocols, moving him through empty corridors toward waiting horses and the road north. The city was still sleeping, most citizens unaware that the monster from their nightmares was being released into the wilderness with instructions never to return. Kaedric breathed the morning air, cold and clean after days of stone cell staleness, and allowed himself a moment of pure sensation before the mathematics resumed. Reese was waiting at the gate, uniform crisp despite the early hour. He handed Kaedric a sealed letter without ceremony. From the Northern Command. They're offering contract work if you're interested. Tactical consultation, strategic planning, the kind of problems that don't have clean solutions. Always recruiting. Kaedric pocketed the letter without reading it. Tell them I'll consider it after I've determined whether survival is worth the continued calculation. That's not funny. Reese's expression was strained. You're too dangerous to waste on self-destruction. Everyone keeps saying that. Kaedric mounted the horse they'd provided, a decent gray that reminded him painfully of arithmetic, but no one can quite articulate what I should be dangerous toward instead. Maybe that's your problem. Reese looked up at him, morning light catching the exhaustion in his features. You're so busy calculating optimal outcomes that you've forgotten people can just choose to matter without requiring strategic justification. Sentiment is, if you say inefficient one more time, I'm going to shoot you myself. The threat was delivered with weary affection. Go north, Kaedric. Figure out what the hell you want to be besides a mathematical engine with residual guilt. And if you decide the world still needs you, come back ready to actually live in it instead of just optimizing it. The escort contingent was mounting up, ready to deliver their condemned cargo to the border and official exile. Kaedric looked back at the city one final time. Marble towers catching dawn light, smoke rising from early fires. The vast machinery of civilization grinding through another day, built on foundations no one wanted to examine too closely. Somewhere in those streets, 16 families were building lives. A blacksmith's daughter wore his mother's jewelry. Seraphine Korvath was consolidating power through uncomfortable truths. And the tribunal was already calculating how to prevent the next person from becoming too honest about what governance required. The mathematics would continue with or without him. But maybe Reese was right. Maybe the question wasn't whether his calculations were correct, but whether efficiency alone justified the cost of performing them. Maybe beauty and meaning didn't require optimization to matter. Maybe there were expensive, impractical things worth maintaining just to prove humans were more than the violence they inflicted in civilization's name. The escort captain signaled departure. Kaedric turned his horse north toward the border and whatever waited beyond it, carrying letters of introduction from Seraphine, contract offers from Reese, and the memory of roses that had required constant care and provided no strategic value whatsoever. Behind him, the city continued functioning. Ahead, the wilderness stretched vast and uncertain. Mathematics yet to be calculated, choices still unmade. And somewhere in the space between those destinations, Duke Kaedric Thornheart began wondering if redemption was possible when you'd already crossed every line that mattered, or if the only remaining option was to cross them consciously, deliberately, with full understanding that some things mattered beyond pure tactical calculation. The guards escorted him in silence through morning fog and wet grass, horses breathing steam into cold air, the border approaching with each measured mile. When they finally reached the marker stones defining the kingdom's northern edge, the captain handed him the supply pack and personal effects as required by law. Then he leaned close, voice low enough that only Kaedric could hear. My sister lived in Ravenholm's eastern quarter. You pulled her family out 2 hours before the fire, gave them your horse, and told them to ride until the smoke disappeared. Kaedric said nothing, waiting. She named her daughter after you. The captain's expression was complicated, grief and gratitude and confusion tangled beyond easy resolution. Just thought you should know that somewhere a child carries your name because someone powerful enough to burn cities chose to save her first. He turned his horse without waiting for response, leading the escort back across the border toward the kingdom that had exiled its most honest monster. Kaedric sat alone at the boundary, watching them disappear into fog, thinking about names and choices and whether either mattered when the mathematics demanded burning everything to save anything. Then he turned north toward the unknown, carrying questions heavier than any chain the tribunal could have forged, and rode into a future where all his calculations would have to account for something more than pure efficiency. The wilderness waited, vast and indifferent, and somewhere in its depths, a man who'd forgotten how to be more than mathematics began the long journey toward remembering what his mother had tried to teach him in a garden full of expensive, impractical roses. The wilderness north of the kingdom had no patience for exiled nobility. 3 days into his banishment, Kaedric discovered that strategic brilliance meant nothing when your horse went lame crossing a ravine and the temperature dropped 20 degrees after sunset. The gray mare he'd named Theorem stumbled on loose shale, her front left leg buckling at an angle that screamed permanent damage, even before he dismounted to confirm the mathematics of broken bone against torn ligament. He stood in failing light, wind cutting through his travel cloak, calculating survival probabilities that narrowed with each passing minute. The horse couldn't continue. Leaving her alive meant slow death by exposure or predators. Mercy required a blade across the throat and the loss of his primary transportation simultaneously. His supplies included enough dried meat and hardtack for maybe 2 weeks if he rationed brutally, a bedroll that wouldn't survive sustained cold, and Seraphine's letters of introduction to settlements he couldn't reach on foot before winter locked the northern passes completely. Kaedric drew his knife and approached Theorem with the same clinical detachment he'd used ordering artillery strikes on populated districts. The mare watched him with dark eyes that reflected nothing, animal awareness registering threat without comprehension of its source. He placed one hand on her neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath warm hide, muscles trembling from pain and fear in equal measure. Just mathematics. One small violence to prevent larger suffering. The same calculation he'd performed 1,000 times in different contexts with different variables. His hand wouldn't move. He stood frozen in the ravine while shadows deepened and temperature continued dropping, knife ready but motionless, confronting the uncomfortable realization that something inside him had shifted during 3 days alone with nothing but wind and silence and the memory of his mother's roses. The calculation was correct. The horse would suffer without intervention. Efficiency demanded immediate action. But efficiency had already cost him a kingdom, a title, 300 lives, and whatever remained of his capacity to sleep without seeing flames consume faces that had trusted him to make better choices. Kaedric lowered the knife. He spent the next hour constructing a shelter from deadfall in his bedroll, creating enough windbreak to protect both himself and the injured mare through the night. Then he used strips from his spare shirt to splint the leg with branches, knowing the effort was probably futile but unable to stop himself from trying anyway. Theorem tolerated the treatment with surprising patience, as if she understood that this particular human was attempting something beyond pure calculation for the first time in recent memory. By the time he finished, full dark had settled and his hands were numb enough that striking flint for fire required 6 attempts. The small blaze he eventually coaxed into existence threw inadequate warmth against the cold, pressing down from mountains that didn't care whether exiled dukes survived their first week of wilderness. He sat with his back against stone, rationing dried meat into portions that wouldn't satisfy hunger but might sustain function, listening to Theorem's breathing gradually steady as shock faded into exhausted sleep. This was inefficient, wasteful, tactically unsound. Also the first decision in years he'd made purely because it felt more human than the alternative. Kaedric wasn't sure which realization disturbed him more. Dawn arrived with frost thick enough to crack when he moved, every joint protesting the night's temperature. Theorem was still alive, which represented either remarkable fortune or postponed inevitability, depending on how optimistically he chose to interpret the mathematics. He checked the splint, noting with surprise that the swelling had stabilized rather than worsening. The leg wasn't healed, might never heal properly, but the mare could potentially bear weight again if given time and rest he couldn't afford. The sound of approaching horses reached him before visual confirmation. Kaedric's hand moved to his sword automatically, body responding to threat patterns before conscious thought engaged. He counted hoofbeats, estimated distance and direction, calculated whether the ravine offered defensive advantage or fatal trap. 4 riders emerged from the tree line, moving with the practiced caution of people who understood that northern wilderness killed the careless efficiently. They wore mismatched armor and weapons that spoke of mercenary work rather than formal military service. The lead rider, a woman with gray streaking through dark hair and a scar bisecting her left eyebrow, raised one hand in the universal signal for peaceful approach. Kadric remained still, sword half drawn, waiting. The woman reined in 10 yards distant, close enough for conversation but respecting the implicit threat calculation. Her accent when she spoke carried northern mountain inflection, vowels flattened by altitude and isolation. You're either remarkably stupid or remarkably unlucky to be camping in a ravine 3 days before the passes close. Both probably. Kadric kept his tone neutral. Though I'm curious how you found me specifically rather than stumbling across me accidentally. We didn't stumble. The woman dismounted with easy competence, moving like someone who'd spent more time in saddle than standing. Lady Corvath sent word that an exiled duke with strategic value might be heading north without adequate preparation. She suggested we offer employment before exposure killed you and wasted her political investment. So you're the mercenary contacts from her letters, Captain Marin Blackthorn. The woman gestured to her companions without taking her eyes off Kadric. The gentleman with the warhammer is Torval, formerly of the King's Guard, before he decided murdering corrupt officers was more satisfying than following their orders. The archer is Lysa, who doesn't talk much but kills at 300 yards regardless of weather. And the kid is Jace, who's learning that romantic notions about mercenary life involve considerably more cold camping and dysentery than the songs suggest. The kid, who couldn't have been more than 19, had the grace to look embarrassed. Kadric assessed them with professional evaluation, noting weapon maintenance, horse condition, the way they positioned themselves for mutual support without obvious coordination. Competent, experienced, dangerous enough to survive northern contracts, but disciplined enough not to trigger his immediate threat response. Lady Corvath mentioned strategic consultation. He returned his sword to its sheath deliberately. What kind of problems require a disgraced duke's particular skill set? Marin's smile was sharp, the kind where villages are getting massacred by organized raiders who move too efficiently to be simple bandits. Where trade caravans disappear completely instead of just getting robbed. Where someone with military training is coordinating attacks that suggest knowledge of Crown Patrol patterns and supply schedules. So you want tactical analysis. We want the raid stopped before they trigger Crown intervention that turns the entire Northern Territory into a military occupation zone. Marin moved closer, boots crunching on frost. And we want someone who understands that sometimes stopping violence requires preemptive violence, calculated precisely enough that civilians don't pay the price for our efficiency. She'd done her research, knew exactly which pressure points would engage his attention, despite every instinct screaming that involvement meant complications he didn't need. Your horse is injured. Marin glanced at Theorem's splinted leg. You're 3 days from the nearest settlement with inadequate supplies and weather turning hostile. You can die here alone maintaining your exile's proud isolation, or you can accept that survival sometimes requires cooperation with people who actually understand what you're trying to accomplish. Which is, she met his stare directly, not becoming the monster everyone fears while still being effective enough to matter. Kadric felt something shift in his chest, recognition of someone who'd asked themselves the same impossible question and hadn't found comfortable answers. He looked at Theorem, at the splint he'd constructed despite tactical wisdom demanding efficiency, at the choice he'd made to preserve something that served no strategic purpose beyond allowing him to sleep slightly better. Then he looked at Marin and her crew, at people who'd chosen to operate in the spaces between law and chaos where the mathematics of violence required both precision and conscience. How far to your base camp? His voice came out rougher than intended. 2 days if we move carefully with an injured horse. Marin's expression suggested she'd expected different resistance. We have a medic who's treated cavalry injuries. Can't promise your mare will ever carry full weight again, but she might survive to retirement if that matters to you. It shouldn't. Kadric began gathering his minimal supplies with methodical efficiency, but apparently I've started making decisions based on criteria beyond pure calculation. So yes, it matters. Progress. Marin's smile was genuine this time. Most people take years to figure out that giving a damn isn't weakness, just expensive. They traveled through landscape that grew steadily more hostile, evergreen forests giving way to exposed ridges where wind carried the promise of snow that would bury anything caught unprepared. Marin set a pace that balanced speed against Theorem's limitations, adjusting without complaint when the mare needed rest. Torval rode beside Cedric during the second day, his warhammer strapped across his back like a statement of violent capability. "Heard you burned Ravenholm." The big man's voice carried no judgment, just observation. 300 dead in a single night, 317. Cedric saw no point in avoiding accuracy. Plus, however many died from injuries sustained during the evacuation panic. "You sound like you counted." "I did. Every casualty report that reached my command, every name I could verify, every family that burned because I decided their city's elimination served strategic necessity." Torval rode in silence for several minutes before responding. "I killed my commanding officer in front of his entire staff. Crushed his skull with my hammer while he was eating breakfast because I'd discovered he was selling military intelligence that got 60 soldiers ambushed and slaughtered. The King's Guard called it murder. I called it necessary correction." "And which was it, actually?" Cedric asked. "Both, probably." Torval's expression remained neutral. "But I sleep better knowing I chose the correction option, even if it cost me rank and legitimacy. Some mathematics require paying prices that can't be calculated in advance." They made camp that night in a cave system Marin's crew had obviously used before. Fire-blackened stone and cached supplies, suggesting regular rotation through established positions. Lissa demonstrated her reputation by dropping a mountain hare at distance that made the shot nearly impossible, providing fresh meat that supplemented their dried rations. Jace approached Cedric while the others prepared the kill, nervous energy vibrating through the kid's frame. "Is it true you taught Lady Corvath everything she knows about political strategy?" "I taught her that power requires understanding who holds it and why." Cedric fed small branches to the fire, watching flames consume wood with the same efficiency that had consumed Ravenholm. Whether she applied those lessons to political strategy specifically is her accomplishment, not mine. "She said you were the most dangerous man in 3 kingdoms because you understood violence without worshipping it. Seraphine has a gift for precise language." Cedric looked at the kid directly. "What's your actual question?" Jace hesitated, then committed. "How do you do it? Make terrible choices without losing yourself completely?" "Everyone here has killed people, made calls that haunt them. But Captain says you burned a city and still saved everyone you could reach first. How does someone hold both things simultaneously?" The question cut deeper than the kid probably intended, exposing the central contradiction Cedric had been wrestling with since exile began. "You don't hold them." The answer emerged more honest than comfortable. "You acknowledge that both existed simultaneously and that pretending otherwise serves nothing except self-deception. I burned Ravenholm because the mathematics demanded it. I evacuated 16 families first because I couldn't quite kill the part of myself that believed individual lives mattered beyond strategic calculation." Both things are true. Both things have consequences. "But which one defines you?" Jace pressed. "Neither. Both." Cedric watched sparks spiral upward into darkness. "I'm learning that definition is what happens when you make choices going forward, not how you categorize decisions already made. The past is fixed. The mathematics don't change based on how guilty I feel about running them." Marin interrupted by dropping the prepared hare near the fire. "Heavy philosophy for a cold night. Save the existential crisis for after we've eaten an established watch rotation." They consumed the meal with minimal conversation, exhaustion and cold making efficiency more appealing than discussion. Afterward, Marin outlined the situation that had prompted Seraphine's recommendation with the clipped precision of someone who'd briefed commanders before. 17 villages hit over 3 months. Raiders move in coordinated groups of 20 to 30, strike at night, kill anyone who resists, take supplies and disappear before Crown patrols arrive. No pattern to target selection initially, but recent hits suggest they're mapping trade routes and communication networks. Recruitment? Cedric's tactical mind engaged automatically, processing information into threat assessment. Possible, but unlikely. Marin traced movements on a crude map weighted with stones. They're not leaving survivors to spread fear or making demands. Just eliminating witnesses and moving efficiently. Suggests military discipline rather than bandit opportunism. Crown involvement. We considered it. But the targets include 2 villages that pay taxes directly to royal collectors, and one of the raids killed a minor noble's nephew. Crown might authorize black operations, but they're rarely stupid enough to eliminate their own revenue streams. Kadrick studied the map, noting distances and timing, calculating logistics that raiders would need for sustained operations across that territory. Supply caches, coordination signals, leadership structure capable of maintaining discipline through multiple engagements. You're looking at organized force with external support. He pointed to cluster patterns on the map. These 3 villages form a triangle around what looks like empty wilderness. But if you're using them as supply points, that empty space becomes a concealed staging area. How well do you know the terrain? Well enough to confirm there's a valley system in there that doesn't appear on most maps. Marin's expression suggested she'd already run similar calculations. Deep enough for concealment, water sources for sustained occupation, multiple exit routes if they need to disperse quickly. So the question becomes, who's funding and directing a private army in northern wilderness? And what's their actual objective beyond village destruction? Kadrick felt the familiar pull of strategic problems, the way complex variables aligned into solvable equations if you approached them with sufficient ruthlessness. You need reconnaissance before direct engagement. Already sent scouts. Torvald's voice emerged from the darkness beyond firelight. None returned. How many? 5. 3 experienced trackers and 2 former military. Marin's tone flattened. Last contact was 6 days ago. So they have early warning systems capable of detecting and eliminating trained scouts without any evidence reaching back to you. Kadrick revised his threat assessment upward. That's significantly more sophisticated than village raiders. That's counterintelligence protocol. The silence that followed carried weight. Lissa spoke for the first time since they'd met, her voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty. You think it's Valdris? The name triggered immediate recognition. Valdris had been a border conflict 3 years prior, Northern Kingdom pressing territorial claims through military escalation until Crown forces pushed them back across traditional boundaries. The war had ended with negotiated settlement and prisoner exchange, but border tensions remained high. If Valdris is establishing covert operations inside our territory, the village raids are reconnaissance and infrastructure mapping for eventual invasion. Kedrick's mind accelerated through implications. They're not trying to conquer villages, they're eliminating potential resistance points and documenting Crown response patterns. Every patrol that investigates a raid provides intelligence about deployment speed, force composition, command structure, which means stopping them requires more than just killing raiders. Marin's expression was grim. Requires eliminating their intelligence-gathering capability without triggering the international incident that gives Valdris justification for open warfare. Exactly. And that kind of operation requires precision, planning, and someone willing to make choices that won't appear in any official record. Kedrick looked around the cave at faces illuminated by firelight. Mercenaries who'd chosen to operate outside formal structures. Soldiers who'd left legitimate service because conscience or circumstance made them incompatible with institutional violence. People who understood that some problems required solutions that kings couldn't authorize and nobles couldn't acknowledge. People remarkably similar to what he'd become during his exile. I'll need complete intelligence on the valley system. He began outlining requirements with the automatic authority of someone who'd commanded actual armies. Detailed terrain maps, water sources, probable entry points. Also need to understand your crew's full capabilities, not just the 4 of you, but everyone involved in your operation. We're not a formal company. Marin's tone carried warning, more like a network of independents who coordinate on specific contracts. Currently can field maybe 30 combatants with varied skill sets. 30 against an entrenched force of unknown size with professional discipline and external support. Kadrick smiled without humor. I've worked with worse odds, but this isn't a straight fight. Direct assault gets everyone killed and achieves nothing. We need intelligence first, then surgical elimination of command structure before they can adapt. You're talking about assassination. Jace's voice carried uncertainty rather than judgment. I'm talking about solving a military problem with minimum casualties on our side and maximum disruption to their operational capacity. Kedrick met the kid's stare. Whether that's assassination or tactical strike depends on which language makes you comfortable. But the mathematics don't change based on vocabulary. Torvald's laugh was dark and approving. Starting to understand why Korvath sent us to recruit you specifically? You think like we do, just with better education and worse impulse control. They spent the next 3 hours reviewing everything Marin's network had gathered. Scout reports before the disappearances. Survivor testimony from the few villagers who'd escaped raids. Trading patterns that might indicate supply movement. Kadric absorbed information with systematic efficiency, building mental models of enemy capability and probable strategy. By the time watch rotation forced conversation to end, he had the outline of an approach that might work if they accepted casualties, operated with perfect timing, and benefited from fortune they couldn't control. Standard military planning, really, just without the institutional resources or legal authority that usually accompanied such operations. Kadric took second watch, sitting near the cave entrance where he could monitor the approaches Marin had indicated were most vulnerable. The night was brutally cold, stars sharp enough to cut against black sky, wind carrying the scent of snow that would arrive within days. Therum slept near the fire's warmth, her breathing steady despite the splinted leg. The mare had survived 3 days of travel that should have killed her, adapting to limitations with animal pragmatism that didn't waste energy on regret or self-recrimination. Maybe there was something to learn from that. Accept damage as new baseline, adjust expectations accordingly, continue functioning within revised parameters. Footsteps approached from inside the cave, careful but not attempting stealth. Marin settled beside him, wrapped in her own cloak, carrying 2 cups of something that steamed in the cold. "Thought you might want this." She handed him what turned out to be tea, bitter and scalding and exactly what his numbed fingers needed, made from pine needles and desperation, but it keeps you warm. They drank in silence for several minutes, watching darkness that held no visible threats but promised danger regardless. Korvath's letter said you were struggling with whether survival justified the cost of your previous choices. Marin's voice was conversational, but the question beneath had edges. Said you needed work that reminded you why competence matters, even when the applications are uncomfortable. Seraphine has a talent for accurate assessment. Kadric sipped the terrible tea, grateful for its warmth. I burned a city because the mathematics demanded it, then spent 3 days in a cell wondering if efficiency without conscience made me functionally indistinguishable from the threats I'd eliminated. And what conclusion did you reach? That the question itself might be more important than any answer. He looked at her directly. That stopping my calculations doesn't make the problems disappear, just ensures someone else solves them with potentially worse methodology. But continuing requires acknowledging that I'm choosing violence as profession, not just executing unavoidable necessity. Marin nodded slowly. Most of my crew reached similar conclusions at various points. Torval after he killed his commander. Lissa after her village was destroyed by raiders and crown forces arrived 3 days late with official sympathy. Me after I realized that following orders meant enabling atrocities I could see coming but had no authority to prevent. So you left legitimate service and became mercenaries. We became people who still believe the work matters but refuse to pretend institutional authority makes violence more legitimate. Marin's smile was tired. Turns out the Northern Territories have considerable demand for that particular skill set, because the Crown can't or won't handle threats that don't fit official threat categories. Because power has always required people willing to operate in spaces between law and chaos, making choices that kings need accomplished but can't acknowledge. You were doing that work with formal authority and institutional resources. Now you're doing it as exile with a lame horse and Korvath's letters of introduction. The mathematics haven't changed, just the letterhead. Kadric felt something loosen in his chest, recognition settling into certainty. You're saying I was always going to end up here. That exile just accelerated the trajectory I was already following. I'm saying that competent people who actually acknowledge what civilization requires tend to end up outside the systems they're protecting. Marin finished her tea, crushing the pine needles between her fingers. Because those systems can't function without violence, but also can't admit that violence is foundational rather than exceptional. So they create people like us, give us the terrible choices, then exile or execute us when the mathematics become too visible. She stood, preparing to return to warmth and sleep. Tomorrow, we reach base camp. You'll meet the rest of the network, see what we've built out here beyond Crown authority and noble oversight. Then you can decide if this is just temporary survival or something you're choosing because it actually matters. What if I can't tell the difference? The question emerged before Kadric could stop it. Then welcome to the permanent condition of everyone who takes this work seriously. Marin's expression was sympathetic and unforgiving simultaneously. The uncertainty doesn't go away. You just learn to function despite it. She left him alone with the darkness and his thoughts. Kaedric watched stars wheel overhead, calculating probabilities, and questioning whether calculation itself was adequate framework for decisions that required more than pure logic. The mathematics had saved lives and destroyed cities, protected kingdoms, and gotten him exiled, proven both absolutely reliable and completely insufficient for questions that mattered beyond tactical outcome. Maybe that was the actual lesson. That some things required calculation and conscience simultaneously, neither adequate alone but potentially functional in combination. His mother would have found that conclusion unsatisfying. She'd believed in beauty and meaning that transcended efficiency, in roses that served no tactical purpose but mattered anyway. Kaedric was learning that maybe both perspectives could be true simultaneously. That the world required both ruthless calculation and irrational care, both strategic necessity and expensive mercy. That holding contradictions without resolving them might be the actual definition of remaining human while engaging with power's demands. Dawn arrived with snow, light flakes that would accelerate into serious weather within hours. They broke camp efficiently and continued north, moving through terrain that grew increasingly hostile as elevation increased. Base camp appeared gradually, concealed so effectively that Kaedric didn't recognize the fortifications until they were within 50 yards. Natural rock formations had been enhanced with careful construction, creating defensive positions that appeared like landscape features, unless you knew the specific patterns indicating human modification. The valley system Marin had mentioned opened before them, sheltered enough to support structures but defensible enough to prevent easy assault. 24 buildings clustered near a central clearing, mixture of permanent construction and temporary shelters, suggesting population that fluctuated based on active contracts. People emerged as they approached, assessing newcomers with the casual wariness of those who'd survived by maintaining appropriate paranoia. Kaedric counted combat scars, noted weapon familiarity, recognized the body language of soldiers who'd learned their craft through necessity rather than formal training. Marin dismounted and immediately began coordinating, delegating Theorem's care to someone who approached the injured mare with professional competence. Within minutes, Kaedric found himself standing in the largest structure, a communal hall where rough tables and maps indicated this space served as planning center and gathering point. A man approached from the back of the hall, moving with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. His face carried burn scars that had healed badly, tissue pulled tight across one side, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence that recognized Kaedric immediately. Duke Thornhart. The man's voice was rough, damaged by the same fire that had marked his face. Or should I say former Duke, given current circumstances. I'm Matthias Chen, formerly Crown Intelligence, currently coordinator for operations that require more discretion than official channels permit. Kaedric noted the introduction's careful phrasing. You're the connection to Seraphine's network. Among others, Matthias gestured to the maps covering the nearest table. Lady Corvath suggested you might be interested in work that applied your strategic capabilities without requiring you to pretend institutional authority made difficult choices more legitimate. She has a gift for manipulation through accurate assessment. Kaedric moved to the maps, immediately cataloging the intelligence they represented. Though I noticed these markings suggest considerably more organization than a simple mercenary network. We prefer to think of ourselves as alternative governance for territories the Crown has essentially abandoned. Matthias joined him at the table. Providing security, mediating disputes, coordinating resources in ways that don't require waiting for official bureaucracy to acknowledge problems exist. Vigilante justice dressed in strategic language. Justice implies moral authority we don't claim. We're just people with specific skills who've chosen to apply them in spaces where the official systems have failed. Matthias traced a line on the map. Like this valley system where Valdris is establishing covert operations while the Crown debates jurisdiction and resource allocation. Marin briefed me on the situation. Kaedric studied the updated intelligence that had been compiled since her departure. You've lost more scouts since she left. 2 more. Matthias's expression was grim, which confirms your assessment that we're facing professional counterintelligence rather than simple raiders. We need operational planning that accounts for enemy capability while minimizing our casualties. You need someone willing to calculate the price and pay it anyway. Kaedric met his stare. That's why Corvath sent you to recruit me specifically. Not for tactical brilliance, but because I've already demonstrated I'll make choices that haunt me if the mathematics justify them. Can you still make those choices? The question was direct, testing. Or has exile and philosophical crisis rendered you too uncertain for operational command? Kaedric thought about Theorem and the splint he'd constructed, despite tactical efficiency demanding otherwise. About 300 dead and 16 families saved. About his mother's roses and the spider's perfect web and everything he'd learned during 3 days alone with wilderness and silence. Then he thought about villages being destroyed by organized raiders, about scouts disappearing into valley systems, about problems that would continue killing people regardless of whether he chose to engage with them. I can make the choices. His voice carried absolute certainty. But I won't pretend they're anything except terrible options selected because the alternatives are worse. And I won't work for people who need me to present comfortable fictions about what we're actually doing. Matthias smiled, the expression pulling his scarred face into something fierce and approving. Then you'll fit here better than you fit anywhere the Crown's authority reached. Welcome to the organization that doesn't exist, doesn't answer to anyone, and somehow manages to keep Northern Territories functioning despite official neglect. He extended his hand. Kedrick looked at it for a long moment, recognizing the decision point. Taking Matthias's hand meant choosing this life consciously, committing to violence as profession rather than exile's survival strategy. Meant acknowledging that he was what Seraphine had described, what good people became when competent enough to survive their own principles. Meant accepting that redemption wasn't forgiveness or transformation, but continuing to function while acknowledging the cost. He gripped Matthias's hand firmly. Over the next week, Kaedric integrated into the network's operations with methodical efficiency. Matthias provided complete intelligence on the Valdris situation, holding back nothing and presenting problems with the same clinical honesty Kaedric had employed briefing commanders during his military service. The raiders were definitely Valdris special operations, confirmed through captured equipment and tactical patterns that matched border conflicts from 3 years prior. Their objective was exactly what Kaedric had calculated: infrastructure mapping and resistance elimination preparing for eventual invasion. The Valley system housed approximately 40 combatants with rotating command structure, supply lines running back across the border through mountain passes that would close completely within weeks. They had early warning systems, counterintelligence protocols, and discipline that made direct assault suicidal. Standard impossible problem requiring solution through uncomfortable mathematics. Kedrick spent 3 days reviewing every detail, building operational models, calculating probabilities that narrowed their options considerably. Then he assembled Matthias, Marin, and the senior operators for planning session that would determine whether the network survived the next month. The hall was packed, 37 people representing every combat-capable individual the network could field without leaving defensive positions completely vulnerable. They watched him with mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Mercenaries and exiles and soldiers who'd chosen conscience over institutional loyalty, all wondering if the disgraced Duke could actually deliver tactical solutions to problems that had been killing them for months. Kedrick stood before the maps and began speaking with the same authoritative precision that had once commanded armies. Direct assault fails. We're outnumbered, they hold defensive terrain, and their discipline means we'd take casualties we can't sustain even if we somehow achieve tactical victory. Conventional thinking says we need Crown intervention, official military response that brings resources we don't have. He paused, meeting eyes around the room. But conventional thinking created this situation. Crown bureaucracy moves too slowly. Official channels require proof that takes weeks to verify. And by the time legitimate authority acknowledges the problem, Valdris will have completed their intelligence gathering and withdrawn across borders we can't cross without starting international war. So what's unconventional thinking? Marin's question carried challenge rather than doubt. We make them come to us. Kaedric traced lines on the map with methodical precision. Valdris needs to complete their infrastructure mapping before winter closes the passes. They're working against timeline pressure we can exploit. We create a target that looks strategically valuable but is actually a trap, force them to commit resources to assault instead of reconnaissance, then eliminate their command structure when they're concentrated and vulnerable. You're describing bait. Torvald's expression was thoughtful. Using ourselves as sacrifice to draw them into engagement we choose. I'm describing acceptable risk calculated to achieve maximum enemy disruption with minimum friendly casualties. Kadrick's tone didn't shift. Yes, someone has to play the bait. Yes, that person faces extreme danger. But one position deliberately exposed is better than having our entire network hunted individually through winter. The hall fell silent, people processing implications and calculating whether the mathematics justified the personal risk. I'll take the position. Jace's voice emerged unexpectedly confident. I'm junior, expendable from operational perspective, and if this is how the work actually functions, then I should understand that firsthand rather than just hearing about it. No. Kedrick's response was immediate and absolute. Bait requires someone with enough credibility that Valdris commits serious resources to the assault. Junior mercenary doesn't justify that investment. Needs to be someone they recognize as genuine strategic threat. He looked directly at Marin. Needs to be me. The silence that followed was profound. Matthias spoke carefully, choosing words with visible precision. You're suggesting we use the exiled Duke Thornheart as bait to draw Valdris operations into engagement they can't resist. That you establish position in exposed terrain, let their intelligence identify you, then hold against assault while we execute flanking elimination of their command structure. That's the operational framework. Kadrick returned his attention to the maps. Valdris knows my reputation, knows Crown exiled me for excessive effectiveness, knows I'm exactly the kind of strategic asset they'd want eliminated before invasion commences. I establish defensive position in this valley junction, make myself visible enough that their scouts confirm identification, then survive whatever force they commit until your assault teams complete the actual objective. Survive how exactly? Lissa's quiet voice cut through calculation. You'd be holding against 40 trained soldiers with whatever force we can spare for your position. That's suicide disguised as tactics. Only if I'm actually trying to win the engagement. Kadrick smiled without humor. I'm not trying to win, just survive long enough. Defensive fortification, prepared fallback positions, acceptable casualties that keep them committed while your teams execute the real operation. I've held worse positions with worse odds. That was with actual army support. Marin's frustration broke through professional composure. This is you and maybe 10 defenders against concentrated assault by people who know their survival requires killing you specifically. Yes. Kadrick met her stare, which is exactly why it works. They'll commit everything to eliminating me because I represent genuine threat to their invasion planning. That commitment concentrates their force, exposes their command structure, creates the vulnerability you need to actually solve this problem. And if you die? Matthias's question was blunt. Then you execute the operation anyway, and the network survives winter without me. Kadrick kept his voice level. My survival is preferable, but not operationally critical. What matters is eliminating Valdris' capability before they complete their intelligence gathering and withdraw beyond our reach. Torvald laughed, the sound carrying dark appreciation. You really have accepted that you're choosing this. Not just surviving circumstances or executing duty, but actively selecting violence as profession because you believe the mathematics justify it. I've accepted that problems exist regardless of whether I engage with them. Kadrick looked around the hall at faces reflecting firelight and uncertainty. I can calculate solutions with uncomfortable precision, or I can maintain comfortable distance while those problems kill people who don't have the luxury of philosophical debate. I'm done pretending detachment is more moral than engagement. The vote, when Matthias called for it, was unanimous for implementation with modifications that increased Kadrick's defensive support from 10 to 15 combatants. Still suicide mathematics by conventional assessment, but enough that survival became possible rather than purely theoretical. They spent the next 4 days preparing. Kadrick selected defensive terrain with obsessive care, choosing valley junction that offered natural fortification, clear sightlines, and fallback positions that could be held sequentially as defenses collapsed. He supervised construction of barriers, placement of concealed weapons, creation of kill zones that would maximize enemy casualties while his own force retreated through prepared positions. The mathematics were brutal and honest. He'd likely lose half his defenders even if everything functioned perfectly. Valdris would commit 30 to 40 combatants to the assault, professional soldiers with coordination and discipline. The engagement would last hours, close-quarters violence where individual skill mattered less than collective endurance. But while that battle consumed attention and resources, Marin would lead 2 assault teams through the mountain passes to hit Valdris base camp when their force was divided and vulnerable. Kill or capture command structure, destroy supply caches, eliminate their intelligence-gathering capability. One terrible choice enabling another. The mathematics of violence stacking into something that might actually work if they accepted the cost. On the final night before deployment, Kadrick found himself unable to sleep despite exhaustion demanding rest. He walked the defensive positions under starlight, checking preparations with methodical thoroughness that was partly tactical and partly ritual, delaying inevitable commitment. Matthias found him near the primary barricade, standing where he'd likely make his last stand if everything collapsed completely. Second thoughts? The scarred man's voice carried no judgment. Constant thoughts. Kadrick didn't turn from his examination of firing angles. About whether this mathematics is accurate or just elaborate justification for choosing violence, I'm comfortable executing. About whether 16 families and one lame horse represent actual conscience or just self-deception sophisticated enough to feel like morality. Does it matter? Matthias moved to stand beside him. The operation functions the same regardless of your motivation. Valdris gets eliminated. Villages stop burning. Network survives winter. It matters to whether I'm choosing this or just following programming so deeply embedded I can't distinguish it from free will. Kadrick finally looked at him directly. You were Crown Intelligence. You've made these calculations before. How do you know when you're solving problems versus just executing the violence you're most skilled at performing? Matthias was quiet for a long moment before answering. I don't. I just keep making choices and hoping the pattern adds up to something beyond efficient brutality. Some days I believe the work matters. Other days, I think we're all just finding elaborate ways to justify doing what we were always going to do anyway. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Matthias's smile was sympathetic and hard. Reassurance is what people sell when they need you to stop questioning whether the mathematics actually justify the cost. Truth is more uncomfortable and considerably less certain. He placed one hand on Kadrick's shoulder briefly, gesture of solidarity between people who'd chosen the same impossible profession. Marin leaves at dawn. You establish position by midday. Valdris scouts should confirm your location within 24 hours. Assault likely 48 hours after that. Try to survive the intervening time without driving yourself insane with second-guessing. He left Kadrick alone with the starlight and defensive preparations. The next morning arrived with brutal clarity. Sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, temperature dropping toward the freezing point that would define the next 6 months. Marin assembled her assault teams with quiet efficiency, checking equipment and reviewing contingencies one final time. She approached Kadrick as her people mounted up, her expression carrying something complex beneath professional composure. Don't die stupidly? The words were gruff, but genuine. Korvath sent me to recruit you because she believes you matter beyond pure tactical capability. Would be disappointed to report back that you got yourself killed playing hero in your first month of exile. I'll endeavor to survive through practical cowardice rather than heroic stupidity. Kadrick managed something approaching a smile. Though I notice you're offering concern disguised as pragmatism, which suggests this network might actually care about personnel beyond their functional utility. Shocking development. Marin's expression softened fractionally. Almost like we're trying to build something that acknowledges people matter even when the mathematics demand sacrifice. Revolutionary concept in our profession. She mounted up, signaling her teams to move out. Kadrick watched them disappear into the mountain passes, calculating timelines and probabilities, knowing that in approximately 60 hours he'd discover whether his strategy was tactical brilliance or elaborate suicide with better documentation. Then he turned to his own defenders. 15 people who'd volunteered to hold impossible position because they believed the work mattered more than comfortable survival. Torval, Lisa, Jace, 12 others whose names and histories he'd studied with the same thoroughness he'd use examining enemy capabilities. People who'd chosen this life through circumstance or conscience, who understood that some problems required terrible solutions executed by people willing to bear the consequences. His people now. His responsibility? His choices that would determine who survived the next 3 days. Let's move out. Kadrick's voice carried command authority that hadn't diminished despite exile and uncertainty. We have defensive positions to establish and very limited time before we discover if these mathematics actually work. They moved through morning cold toward the valley junction where Kadrick had calculated the engagement would occur, carrying weapons and supplies and the knowledge that some of them wouldn't return regardless of how well the plan functioned. And somewhere in the motion between safety and danger, Between calculation and commitment, Kaedric felt the final pieces of his transformation settle into place. He wasn't the Duke who'd burned Ravenholm anymore. Wasn't the exile wandering northern wilderness with broken horse and philosophical crisis. He was something new and terrible and potentially necessary, someone who'd chosen violence as profession with full understanding of its cost, who'd accepted that redemption wasn't transformation, but continuing to function while acknowledging the price, who'd learned to hold contradictions without resolving them and call that progress towards something resembling humanity. The Valley Junction opened before them, terrain matching his calculations perfectly, offering everything the mathematics required for one final choice that couldn't be reversed or regretted, only executed and survived, or not. The Valdris scouts found them exactly 36 hours after Kaedric established his defensive position. He watched them through the early morning mist, two figures moving along the ridgeline with professional caution that confirmed everything his intelligence had suggested about enemy capability. They maintained proper distance, used natural cover efficiently, and withdrew the moment they'd confirmed what they came to verify: that the exiled Duke Thornheart had fortified a valley junction with minimal force and maximum visibility. That the strategic threat Valdris had been calculating how to eliminate was now positioned perfectly for concentrated assault. That someone had made a catastrophic tactical error worth exploiting immediately. Kaedric lowered his field glass and turned to Torval, who'd been observing the same ridge from a different angle. They saw what we wanted them to see. The big man's voice carried satisfaction beneath professional assessment. Clean identification, no indication they detected our actual defensive depth. They'll report back that you're exposed with maybe 20 defenders maximum, which gives us 48 hours before assault commences. Kaedric began walking the fortifications again, checking preparations with methodical obsession that kept his mind occupied and his hands busy. Marin's teams should be in position within 36 hours. Timing is tighter than I'd prefer, but still functional, assuming nothing changes their operational timeline. Lissa had approached silently, the way she did everything, her presence announced only when she chose to speak, assuming they commit the force we're calculating rather than adapting to variables we haven't anticipated. That's why we call it strategy rather than certainty. Kaedric managed something resembling confidence despite the acid churning in his gut. We've created conditions that strongly incentivize specific enemy response. Whether they actually respond that way determines if we're tactically brilliant or elaborately dead. Jace laughed from his position near the primary barricade, the sound carrying nervous energy that hadn't diminished despite a week of preparation. Remind me why I volunteered for this again? Because you're young enough to still believe the work matters more than comfortable survival. Torval's response was gentle despite the brutal honesty. Give it a few more years and you'll develop proper self-preservation instincts that make this kind of operation seem insane. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each hour marked by incremental adjustments to defensive positions and mounting tension that made every sound feel like preliminary assault. Kaedric rotated his defenders through rest cycles, ensuring everyone had opportunity to sleep despite the impossibility of actual rest. He found himself unable to follow his own directive, spending the night walking perimeter and reviewing contingencies with compulsive thoroughness that Matthias had warned him about before departure. "You're going to exhaust yourself before the engagement even starts," the scarred man had said. "Learn to trust your preparation and conserve energy for when the mathematics actually demand it." But trusting preparation required accepting that variables beyond his control would determine outcomes he'd staked lives upon. Required acknowledging that perfect calculation still left room for catastrophic failure if any assumption proved incorrect. Required faith in something beyond pure mathematics, which was precisely the capability Kaedric had spent years eliminating from his decision-making framework. Dawn of the second day arrived with frost thick enough to make every surface treacherous and visibility that stretched for miles across terrain that offered nowhere left to hide. The defensive position looked exactly as designed, a fortified junction that appeared strong enough to hold briefly, but vulnerable enough to justify aggressive assault. Bait presented with sufficient authenticity that predators would commit before recognizing the trap. Kaedric was reviewing ammunition distribution when Lysa appeared beside him with expression that immediately triggered every threat assessment protocol he'd developed. "We have a problem." Her voice was flat professional tone that meant the situation was worse than the words suggested. Rider approaching from the south, moving fast, displaying distress signals. "From our network?" Kaedric's mind accelerated through implications. "Can't confirm yet." Too distant for identification, but the approach vector and signal pattern match Marin's communication protocols, which meant either legitimate messenger or enemy intelligence sophisticated enough to compromise their operational security completely. Kedrick moved to observation position, field glass tracking the distant rider who was pushing their horse hard enough to risk injury on the frozen ground. The distress signals were correct. The approach angle matched what friendly forces would use. But something felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate beyond years of surviving by trusting instincts that operated faster than conscious analysis. Defensive positions. His command voice cut through morning quiet with absolute authority. Full readiness until we confirm identity and intent. Lissa, position for clean shot if this turns hostile. Torval, secure the perimeter entrance. They moved with professional efficiency. Weapons ready but not quite aimed, bodies coiled with potential violence held barely in check. The rider resolved into recognizability as distance closed. Young woman Kedrick recognized from Marin's assault team, someone he'd reviewed during mission planning as competent scout with 2 years' experience in northern operations. She was alone, which was the first major deviation from protocol. Assault teams operated in pairs minimum. Solo return meant either catastrophic casualties or deliberate separation. She dismounted badly, nearly falling, exhaustion or injury making her movements clumsy. Blood stained her jacket, fresh enough to still be wet despite the cold. Ambush. The word emerged between gasping breaths as Torval caught her before she collapsed. They knew. Valdris knew about the assault teams. Had counter-ambush prepared. Marin's pinned down in the Valley Pass, both teams taking heavy casualties. Kedrick felt ice settle into his chest, cold calculation overriding emotional response through disciplined reflex. How many did we lose? He kept his voice level despite everything inside him screaming that the mathematics had failed catastrophically. Don't know exact count. The scout was shaking, shock setting in properly now. At least 8 confirmed dead when I broke away to get word back. Marin sent me to warn you that the operation is compromised, that Valdris has intelligence about our entire network structure. That's impossible. Lissa's voice carried absolute certainty. We maintained operational security. No communications that could be intercepted, no patterns that would reveal coordination, unless someone told them. Jay spoke from his position at the barricade, voice tight with realization. Unless we have a traitor feeding intelligence to Valdris from inside the network. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications that rewrote every assumption Kedrick had built strategy upon. He looked at the scout, noting details his tactical mind cataloged automatically. Blood pattern consistent with grazing wound rather than serious injury. Horse pushed hard, but not to complete exhaustion despite alleged urgency. Body language that read as fear, but with underlying tension that suggested something beyond simple panic. And the fundamental problem that if Marin's teams were truly pinned down and taking casualties, sending solo messenger made no tactical sense when every combatant was needed for defensive action or coordinated withdrawal. Step away from Torval. Kedrick's command emerged cold and absolute, slowly, hands visible. The scout's expression shifted fractionally, micro-expression of calculation replacing shock so briefly that anyone not watching specifically for deception would have missed it. Sir, I don't understand. You're not injured badly enough to justify the blood volume. Kedrick moved closer, hand on his sword hilt. Your horse isn't exhausted enough for the distance and speed you claimed. And Marin would never send solo messenger when she needed every defender for tactical withdrawal. Everything happened simultaneously. The scout's hand went for a concealed blade. Lissa's arrow took her through the shoulder before the weapon cleared its sheath. Torval caught her as she fell, controlling the descent with one massive hand while the other secured the knife she'd been reaching for. Kedrick knelt beside her, meeting her eyes with clinical detachment that had once allowed him to order cities burned. Who sent you? His voice carried no anger, just absolute certainty that he would extract the information through whatever methodology proved necessary. And what's the actual situation with Marin's teams? The woman spat blood, her expression transforming from manufactured fear into something calculating and vicious. You really think I'm going to tell you anything? That your reputation for ruthless interrogation means something out here beyond Crown authority? I think you're going to tell me because the alternative is considerably worse than whatever Valdris offered you for cooperation. Kedrick gestured to Torval. Secure her. We'll extract intelligence after we've addressed the immediate tactical situation. What immediate tactical situation? Jace's voice carried confusion. If she's lying about the ambush, Then the actual assault is coming now instead of tomorrow. Kedrick was already moving toward observation positions. The deception was designed to pull our attention south, while Valdris approaches from the north. Classic misdirection that only works if your target commits resources to investigating the false threat. He raised his field glass, scanning ridgelines systematically, searching for the indicators that would confirm his revised assessment. The Valdris force emerged from concealment with professional precision. 43 combatants moving in coordinated elements that suggested command structure more sophisticated than basic raider organization. They'd positioned during the night, using darkness and the scouts' distraction to achieve approach angles that turned Kaedric's defensive calculations into lethal vulnerabilities. Someone had given them complete intelligence about the fortification layout, defensive positions, and planned firing lines. Someone inside the network had sold them everything they needed to transform Kaedric's trap into his own execution. Defensive adjustment. His voice cut through rising panic with absolute command authority. North positions are compromised, fall back to secondary line. Lissa, you're on mobile targeting, priority on their command element. Torval, secure the prisoner, then reinforce the eastern barricade. They moved instantly, trained response overriding fear through muscle memory and professional discipline. Kedrick watched the Valdris force advance, calculating revised probabilities that had narrowed considerably in the wrong direction. They knew his defensive depth, understood his fallback positions, and were moving with coordination that suggested real-time intelligence about his force disposition, which meant the traitor wasn't just the scout. Someone currently inside his defensive perimeter was feeding information to enemy commanders actively. The first assault hit the northern barricade with concentrated force designed to overwhelm through immediate violence. Crossbow bolts hammered defensive positions, while assault elements moved with covering fire. Professional infantry tactics executed with textbook precision. Kaedric's defenders returned fire with disciplined volleys, making every shot count against enemies who'd positioned to minimize exposure. Bodies fell on both sides, the mathematics of violence reducing humans to casualty statistics with brutal efficiency. Fall back to second position. Kedrick's command carried across the engagement despite the noise. Controlled withdrawal, maintained firing discipline. They retreated through prepared positions exactly as planned, leaving obstacles and prepared defenses that forced Valdris to slow their advance. The system was working despite the compromised intelligence, buying time and extracting cost from enemy forces. But time was the resource Kaedric no longer had in adequate supply. If Marin's teams were actually pinned down, or worse, the flanking assault that was supposed to eliminate Valdris' command structure would never materialize, which meant Kaedric's defensive position had transformed from deliberate bait into isolated target facing overwhelming force. He was halfway through calculating withdrawal options when Matthias appeared from the southern approach, moving with urgency that immediately recalibrated Kaedric's threat assessment. The scarred coordinator reached defensive lines breathing hard, his expression carrying information worse than the tactical situation. "We need to talk." Matthias grabbed Kaedric's arm, pulling him toward cover with force that suggested this wasn't optional consultation. "Right now, away from the others. We're in the middle of combat engagement, which is exactly why this conversation can't wait." Matthias's intensity overrode tactical objection. "Because what I'm about to tell you changes everything about who you can trust and how this operation actually functions." They moved to a position sheltered from direct fire, close enough to monitor the engagement but with sufficient privacy for conversation that clearly required it. Matthias spoke rapidly, words emerging with practiced efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this disclosure. "The network has been compromised for 6 weeks. We discovered it 4 days ago when intelligence patterns started showing enemy awareness of operations that should have been completely secure. Someone high in the command structure has been feeding Valdris detailed information about our capabilities, positions, and strategic planning." Kaedric felt his tactical framework fracture, assumptions dissolving faster than he could reconstruct operational understanding. "Why wasn't I briefed before deployment?" His voice came out colder than intended. "Because we weren't certain who the traitor was until yesterday." Matthias met his stare with absolute honesty. "And the primary suspect was Marin." The world stopped. Sound continued, combat engagement proceeding with mechanical inevitability, but Kaedric's perception narrowed to single point of catastrophic realization. Marin, the captain who'd recruited him, who'd spent a week integrating him into network operations, who'd left 48 hours ago leading assault teams that were supposedly pinned down by counterambush that shouldn't have been possible unless someone had provided exact intelligence about approach vectors and timing. You're telling me the assault was deliberate sacrifice? Kedrick's calculation accelerated through implications. That Marin fed Valdris complete intelligence, positioned me as isolated target, and is currently eliminating any network elements loyal enough to resist whatever she's actually planning. We believe she's negotiating independent contract with Valdris. Matthias's voice carried grief beneath professional assessment. Using network resources as bargaining position, offering to eliminate resistance elements in exchange for command authority over northern territories after invasion completes. The scout was hers, not Valdris' deception, but Marin's operative sent to confirm I was committed to defensive position before final assault. Matthias nodded slowly. We intercepted communications 3 hours ago. Marin's been coordinating with Valdris Command for weeks, providing intelligence, sabotaging operations, positioning the network for hostile takeover timed with invasion. Why tell me now? Kedrick watched Valdris forces repositioning for second assault wave. Why not simply withdraw and let this engagement eliminate both problems simultaneously? Because despite everything, I still believe you're trying to accomplish something beyond pure self-interest. Matthias's expression was fierce and exhausted, because the network needs someone willing to make terrible choices without selling out to the highest bidder. And because whatever you've become during your exile, you're still more trustworthy than someone who'd sacrifice her own people for political advancement. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Kedrick. That he'd been recruited specifically because someone believed the Duke who'd burned cities was somehow more reliable than the mercenary captain who'd built this network. That his capacity for ruthless calculation was being positioned as virtue compared to strategic betrayal. That the very qualities that had gotten him exiled were now exactly what made him valuable to people who operated beyond institutional authority. What do you want from me? The question emerged more tired than he'd intended. Survive this engagement. Matthias pulled out a sealed letter, pressing it into Kedrick's hands. This contains complete intelligence on Marin's network connections, Valdris coordination, and the secondary command structure we've been building as contingency. If you make it out alive, use it to rebuild something that doesn't eat itself through internal betrayal. And if I don't survive, then at least you'll die knowing someone trusted you with truth instead of using you as disposable asset. Matthias managed something resembling a smile. Progress from where you started, even if the ending is the same. A crossbow bolt hammered into stone inches from Matthias's head, Valdris forces adjusting their fire to target the obvious command consultation. Matthias moved to leave, then paused. One more thing. Torval and Lessa are clean. Jace we're uncertain about, but he's probably just inexperienced rather than actively compromised. Everyone else in your current force is questionable at best. So I'm defending a position with troops who might turn hostile the moment Valdris offers better terms. Welcome to command authority beyond institutional structures. Matthias's expression was sympathetic and unforgiving. Trust has to be earned individually rather than assumed through hierarchy. It's exhausting and unreliable and the only system that actually functions when formal authority collapses. He disappeared into the chaos of combat repositioning, leaving Kedrick alone with sealed intelligence and the knowledge that everything he'd calculated about this operation had been constructed on foundation of strategic betrayal. The second assault wave hit harder than the first, Valdris committing reserves now that they'd tested defensive capabilities and confirmed the intelligence about force composition. They moved with confident aggression, professional soldiers executing operation against isolated target that couldn't possibly hold against sustained pressure. Kedrick fought with mechanical precision. Sword work that had once made him legendary in close quarters transformed into brutal efficiency that kept him alive through moments where calculation alone would have failed. Around him, his defenders held positions with desperate competence, buying time they couldn't afford. Through violence, they were running out of capacity to sustain. Torval fought like the monument he resembled, Warhammer crushing enemy soldiers with impacts that sounded like breaking stone. Lissa's arrows found throats and eye sockets with impossible accuracy, each shot eliminating threats before they could fully materialize. And Jace held the eastern barricade with surprising effectiveness, the kid's inexperience offset by raw determination that refused to acknowledge when situations became tactically hopeless. But determination didn't change mathematics that continued degrading in the wrong direction. They'd lost 4 defenders in the first assault. 3 more fell during the second wave. Ammunition was depleting faster than conservative estimates projected, and Valdres showed no indication of breaking off despite casualties that should have forced operational reassessment, because they knew reinforcement wasn't coming. New Marin had positioned this engagement as final elimination rather than tactical delay. New Kaedric was trapped in the exact scenario his strategy had been designed to avoid. Third position. He gave the order during brief lull between assault waves. Controlled fallback. Prepare for sustained defense. They withdrew deeper into the fortification system, abandoning outer positions that had been prepared as expendable layers. The defenders moved with exhausted professionalism. People who understood they were dying slowly but refused to accelerate the timeline through panic or collapse. Kaedric found himself thinking about his mother's roses again, expensive, impractical beauty that served no tactical function but had mattered to her regardless of efficiency arguments. She died believing the world needed people who maintained irrational commitments to meaning beyond pure calculation. He wondered if she'd be proud or horrified to see what those lessons had produced. A son who could hold defensive positions through accumulated violence while simultaneously calculating exactly how many people would die before the mathematics finally failed completely. A son who'd learned to value both ruthless efficiency and expensive mercy without resolving the contradiction between them. A son who was probably going to die in a frozen valley because he'd trusted that competence and conscience could coexist in a profession that seemed designed to eliminate both. The fourth assault came at dusk. Valdres forces using failing light to mask approach angles. They hit simultaneously from 3 directions, coordination that required command structure observing from protected position and communicating through signals. Kaedric's depleted force couldn't intercept. This was the killing blow. The mathematics that ended resistance through overwhelming application of force against defenders who'd exhausted their capacity to sustain operation. Kaedric felt the calculation complete itself with absolute certainty, probability narrowing to single inevitable outcome. They were going to lose. Not eventually, not theoretically. Right now, in the next 10 minutes, through violence that would consume everyone who'd trusted his strategic assessment. He looked at Torval, at Lisa, at Jace holding positions with desperate courage that deserved better leadership than someone whose first major operation beyond Crown authority had been compromised by traitor he'd failed to detect. Then he looked at the sealed letter Matthias had given him, the intelligence that was supposed to rebuild network operations after this engagement concluded, after he survived to implement whatever came next. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. He could stay, fight to last stand, die alongside defenders who'd volunteered based on trust he hadn't earned but had accepted anyway. Or he could withdraw, preserve the intelligence Matthias had entrusted him with, rebuild operations from foundation that acknowledged betrayal as operational reality rather than exceptional failure. Could choose survival over loyalty, strategic value over immediate courage, future capability over present sacrifice. Could make the calculation that had defined his entire career, choosing mathematics that saved more lives in aggregate even when the immediate cost felt like fundamental betrayal. Torval appeared beside him during the brief pause before final assault, the big man's face carrying expression that suggested he'd run the same calculation and reached identical conclusion. "You need to go." The words emerged without judgment or accusation. "Whatever Matthias gave you matters more than this position. We can hold long enough for you to withdraw south, circle around their assault force, reach the network's secondary positions. I'm not abandoning people who trusted my tactical assessment. You're not abandoning us." Torval's smile was sad and knowing. "You're accepting that sometimes the mathematics require choosing future operations over current engagement. We all knew the risks signing on for this. None of us expected guaranteed survival." Lissa joined them, appearing from shadow with her usual unnerving silence. "Torval's right. Your survival serves strategic purpose. Ours just delays inevitable outcome by minutes that won't change final mathematics." She pressed a sealed packet into his hands, her expression fierce beneath exhaustion. "Letters for families. People who should know what happened here and why. Can't trust anyone in the current network structure, but if you rebuild something functional, make sure they understand their people didn't die for betrayal, even if they died because of it." Kaedric looked at them both. At faces carrying acceptance of mathematics he'd taught them to calculate with ruthless precision, and felt something inside him break in a way that burning cities hadn't quite managed, because this was the cost of his education. Of teaching people to run calculations that prioritized aggregate outcomes over immediate loyalty. of building framework where survival required treating humans as variables to be optimized, rather than people who mattered beyond strategic value. This was what competence produced when separated from the comfortable fictions that made institutional authority feel legitimate. Raw mathematics that saved kingdoms and consumed everyone who operated them honestly. "I'll rebuild." His voice came out hoarse with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "And I'll make sure everyone knows you held this position because the work mattered, not because some exiled duke's strategy put you in an impossible situation. We held this position because we chose to." Torvald's grip on his shoulder was brief but solid. "Because we believe that problems require solutions even when the mathematics are terrible. You taught us that. Now go prove it was worth learning." Jace appeared from the eastern barricade, his young face carrying realization that arrived too late to change anything. "You're leaving." Not accusation, just statement of fact wrapped in devastation. "I'm surviving so the network can rebuild after Marin's betrayal collapses." Kadric met the kid's stare directly. "And you're coming with me because you're the only defender I can confirm isn't compromised by whatever she's arranged." "I should stay. I should fight with them. You should live." Lissa's voice cut through the kid's resistance with absolute authority. "You should learn from this that trust requires verification and loyalty requires limits. That sometimes the mathematics demand survivors who'll carry forward the work even when staying feels more honest." The final assault began before further argument could develop. Valdris forces committing everything to overwhelming the position they'd been maneuvering to eliminate for 3 days. Kedrick grabbed Jace and ran. They moved through the southern withdrawal route he'd prepared as contingency, scrambling across frozen ground while combat sounds echoed behind them. Crossbow bolts hammered stone where they'd been standing seconds before, Valdris forces recognizing the withdrawal and attempting to prevent it. But the defensive system he'd designed functioned exactly as calculated. Obstacles and prepared positions, buying time through violence that cost the enemy more than simple pursuit justified. Behind them, Torval and Lissa held the final positions with desperate competence, making Valdris pay for every yard gained through casualties that mounted faster than their commanders could adjust tactics. Kadric heard the big man's warhammer ring against armor and stone, heard Lissa's bow singing its lethal rhythm, heard defenders fighting and dying to buy him the time to escape with intelligence that might rebuild what Marin's betrayal had destroyed, and kept running, because the mathematics demanded it, even when every instinct screamed to turn back and die with people who'd trusted his strategy enough to sacrifice themselves for its continuation. They reached the secondary position an hour after full dark, both exhausted and wounded, Jace bleeding from a gash across his ribs, where crossbow bolt had come closer than survival should have allowed. Kadric collapsed against cold stone, hands shaking with something beyond physical exertion, staring at the sealed letter Matthias had given him with absolute certainty that opening it would commit him to path with no remaining exits. Behind them, the sounds of combat had stopped. Either Valdris had overwhelmed the defenders completely, or some negotiated cessation had occurred that made continued violence tactically unnecessary. Either way, Torval and Lissa were dead or captured, their survival serving no purpose to enemies who'd achieved their operational objectives. Jace sat nearby, pressing cloth against his wound with mechanical attention, his face carrying an expression of someone whose understanding of how the world functioned had just undergone violent reconstruction. "They died for you." The kid's voice was hollow. "They chose to die so you could escape with whatever that letter contains. They chose to die for the possibility that someone could rebuild operations that don't consume themselves through internal betrayal." Kadric's correction emerged more defensive than he'd intended. "There's a difference, is there?" Jace looked at him with eyes that had aged years in the past 6 hours. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the mathematics you're so proud of just required sacrificing everyone who trusted you so you could preserve strategic capability for operations that don't exist yet." The accusation landed with precision that made Kadric's earlier tactical assessment seem clumsy by comparison. Because the kid was right. The mathematics had functioned exactly as designed, prioritizing future capability over present loyalty, strategic value over immediate courage, survival over sacrifice. Had functioned the same way they'd functioned at Ravenholm, reducing human lives to variables and equations that optimized for outcomes Kadric deemed most valuable. Had produced results that were tactically sound, strategically justifiable, and morally devastating in ways that made comfortable sleep impossible and self-deception more difficult with each iteration. He opened the sealed letter with hands that had steadied through force of will, reading Matthias's intelligence by moonlight that turned blood-stained pages silver and sterile. The information was comprehensive and damning. Names, locations, coordination protocols, complete documentation of Marin's network connections and Valdris arrangements. Evidence of betrayal that extended deeper than single captain's ambition, suggesting systematic corruption that had been consuming the network for months before anyone recognized the pattern. And at the bottom, Matthias's final assessment, written in hand that had cramped from exhaustion or emotion. If you're reading this, you survived the engagement that was designed to eliminate you. That makes you either extraordinarily lucky or significantly more competent than the people who tried to kill you. Possibly both. The network is compromised beyond simple repair. Marin's betrayal revealed structural vulnerabilities that can't be addressed without complete reconstruction. What we built was insufficient to prevent infiltration by people willing to sacrifice principle for advancement. You have opportunity to build something different, something that acknowledges betrayal as operational reality rather than exceptional failure, something that requires verification rather than assuming loyalty through shared hardship. Whether you choose that opportunity or simply disappear into northern wilderness with your survival intact is calculation only you can make. But if you do choose rebuilding, remember that the mathematics alone weren't sufficient. We also needed people willing to hold positions despite impossible odds because they believed the work mattered beyond pure strategic value. People like Torval and Lisa, who chose sacrifice over survival because they'd learned that some things required protection even when the calculations suggested abandonment. You taught them that choice was possible. Now prove it wasn't just sophisticated self-deception that made their deaths meaningless. Kedrick read the words 3 times, each iteration cutting deeper through defenses he'd constructed around the fundamental question of whether his entire framework was tactical. Brilliance or elaborate justification for doing what came naturally to someone who'd learned to calculate without conscience interfering. Jace had fallen into exhausted sleep despite his injuries, the kid's youth asserting biological needs that overrode philosophical crisis. Kedrick sat alone with moonlight and mathematics, and the knowledge that every choice he'd made since exile had led to this moment, to sitting in frozen darkness with intelligence that could rebuild operations or simply provide comprehensive documentation of how thoroughly he'd failed at the first major opportunity beyond Crown authority. To holding sealed letters from people who died believing his strategy was worth the sacrifice, their families deserving explanation that would require admitting the mathematics had failed catastrophically despite technical correctness. To confronting the reality that competence without conscience produced exactly what the tribunal had feared when they'd exiled him. Someone capable of making terrible choices with ruthless efficiency and calling it necessity rather than acknowledging the horror. But competence with conscience produced its own devastation. 16 families saved and 300 burned. Defensive positions held through accumulated violence that cost everyone who'd trusted the strategy. Survival purchased through sacrifice that made the mathematics feel like betrayal disguised as tactical wisdom. Maybe that was the actual lesson Kedrick kept failing to learn. That the contradiction couldn't be resolved, that holding both ruthless calculation and expensive mercy simultaneously was the permanent condition rather than transitional state before reaching comfortable certainty, that remaining human while engaging with power's demands required accepting devastation as ongoing cost rather than temporary price before redemption arrived, that he would spend the rest of his life making terrible choices and questioning whether they were necessary or just familiar, tactical or just efficient expression of violence he was most skilled at executing. The mathematics said rebuild. Use Matthias's intelligence to construct something that acknowledged betrayal and required verification. Honor Torval and Lissa's sacrifice by proving their deaths enabled something beyond Kedrick's personal survival. His conscience said disappear. Accept that his framework was fundamentally broken despite technical precision. Stop inflicting his calculations on people who deserved better leadership than someone whose first instinct was always optimization through acceptable casualties. The wilderness stretched vast and indifferent around him, offering no guidance beyond the eternal truth that survival required making choices regardless of their adequacy. Dawn would arrive within hours, and Kedrick would have to decide what kind of person he'd become when forced to choose between abandoning the work that mattered or continuing despite accumulating evidence that his methods consumed everyone who trusted them. Would have to decide if rebuilding was honor or hubris, necessity or self-deception. The only path forward or just the most familiar direction for someone who'd spent his entire life solving problems through violence calculated precisely enough to call it strategy, would have to decide if he was the competent leader Matthias believed in, or the monster the tribunal had feared, and whether that distinction mattered beyond making himself feel better about choices that produced identical outcomes regardless of motivation. The sealed letters from Torval and Lissa felt heavy in his hands, physical weight of responsibility that no calculation could optimize away. And somewhere in the darkness between wilderness and warfare, between mathematics and meaning, Duke Kaedric Thornhart understood with absolute clarity that whatever choice he made in the coming hours would define not just his future but his fundamental nature in ways that could never be reversed or regretted. Only executed and survived. Or not. Kaedric made his decision at dawn, watching light bleed across frozen landscape with the same clinical detachment he'd used calculating artillery trajectories against populated districts. He would rebuild, not because the mathematics justified it, or because Matthias's intelligence demanded utilization, or even because Torval and Lysa's sacrifice required honoring through continued operation. He would rebuild because stopping meant accepting that competence combined with conscience was fundamentally impossible, that the contradiction between ruthless efficiency and expensive mercy couldn't be held simultaneously by anyone attempting to function in spaces where power demanded terrible choices. And if he accepted that impossibility, then Ravenholm had been pure atrocity rather than necessary evil, executed by someone who'd at least tried to minimize casualties while achieving strategic objectives. Then every choice he'd made since exile was just sophisticated self-deception, rather than genuine attempt to remain human while engaging with violence as profession. Then his entire framework collapsed into either monster or coward, calculation without conscience or paralysis through philosophical crisis, and neither option served the problems that would continue existing regardless of his participation. So he would rebuild, knowing the effort might produce identical devastation, understanding that his methods consumed people who trusted them, accepting that he would spend every remaining day questioning whether necessity was real or just comfortable language for doing what came naturally to someone trained in efficient violence. He woke Jace with deliberate gentleness, recognizing the kid had earned consideration beyond tactical urgency. The young mercenary stirred slowly, pain from his wound making movement cautious. His eyes opened to reality that hadn't improved during sleep, processing continued existence with visible surprise. "You're still here," Jace's voice carried accusation wrapped in relief. "Thought you might disappear during the night. Take Matthias's intelligence and leave me to explain the mathematics to whoever found the bodies." "I considered it." Kaedric handed him water and dried meat, basic sustenance before movement became necessary. "But apparently I've developed expensive habits around responsibility that don't optimize well for pure survival. So what now? We heading back to base camp?" "No base camp to return to." Kaedric began organizing supplies with methodical efficiency. "Marin's betrayal means anyone still there is either compromised or dead. We're establishing new operations from foundation that assumes infiltration rather than treating it as exceptional failure. Just the two of us? Initially. Then we recruit carefully, verify loyalty through demonstrated action rather than shared history. Build something that acknowledges humans are fundamentally untrustworthy when offered sufficient incentive for betrayal." "That's bleak." Jace accepted the food, chewing mechanically. Also probably accurate given recent experience. They moved south through terrain that grew gradually less hostile as elevation decreased, traveling with caution that balanced speed against detection risk. Kaedric's tactical mind cataloged threats automatically. Years of combat command translating landscape into tactical opportunities and vulnerability assessments. But underneath the professional evaluation ran current of something darker and more honest. Recognition that he was leading another person into operations that would likely consume them both through. Accumulated violence or strategic betrayal or simple exhaustion from maintaining impossible contradictions. Recognition that he was choosing this path anyway because the alternative was abandoning work that mattered to people who'd never developed the competence or stomach for its execution. Recognition that maybe this was the actual definition of responsibility in spaces beyond institutional authority. Not having good options, just choosing the least catastrophic available direction and committing despite justified uncertainty about outcomes. They reached the first settlement 3 days after the defensive position fell. Small trading post that served as nexus for northern commerce and information exchange. Kaedric observed from distance, noting patterns and security before committing to approach. The settlement showed signs of recent violence. Buildings damaged by fire, fresh graves outside the perimeter, defensive preparations suggesting ongoing threat assessment. Valdris raiders hit them 2 weeks ago. Jace had better eyes for detail than Kaedric gave him credit for. Killed maybe a dozen people, took supplies, left warning that cooperation was preferable to resistance, which means Marin's intelligence sharing enabled Valdris to map civilian infrastructure with precision that makes invasion considerably more efficient. Kedrick felt cold calculation engage. Tactical mind processing implications faster than emotional response could interfere. They're not just preparing military operation, they're establishing control framework that can activate immediately after Crown forces are neutralized. So we warn people? Get word to settlements that Valdris is coming? We gather intelligence first. Kedrick began moving toward the settlement perimeter, choosing approach angle that minimized threat appearance. Determine scope of Valdris preparation. Identify their operational timeline. Understand what resources they've committed before we start broadcasting warnings that might trigger early invasion to prevent defensive coordination. They entered the settlement with weapons visible but not drawn, letting guards assess them as potential threats who'd chosen to present themselves openly rather than infiltrate through deception. The response was professional wariness, multiple crossbows tracking their movement while someone fetched whoever made security decisions. The woman who emerged from the central trading house carried herself with authority that came from surviving multiple attempts at violent displacement. She was maybe 40, weathered by northern climate and harder experiences, scar tissue mapping violence across visible skin. State your business. Her voice cut through cold air with absolute command. And make it honest, because we've had enough liars this season to last several lifetimes. Kaedric recognized leadership competence when he encountered it. Years of evaluating commanders translating into immediate respect for someone who'd earned authority through demonstrated capability, intelligence gathering, and potential recruitment. He kept his tone professional, equal speaking to equal. We're rebuilding operations after discovering our previous network was compromised by someone coordinating with Valdris invasion planning. Thought settlements that have already encountered raiders might be interested in cooperation that doesn't involve waiting for Crown forces to arrive 3 weeks after everyone's dead. The woman studied him with assessment that missed nothing, cataloging details with practiced efficiency that suggested military background or equivalent survival education. You're the exiled Duke, not question. Statement of recognition. Thornheart. Burned Ravenholm and got banished for excessive honesty about what governance actually requires. Rumors said you died in the northern wilderness or joined Valdris yourself. Rumors were optimistic on both counts. Kaedric managed something resembling a smile, though I understand why people might assume the second given recent events. What's your name and what authority do you hold here? Kira Denholm. I coordinate security and trade negotiations for 17 settlements in this region. Used to do similar work for Crown military before I realized official channels were more interested in maintaining comfortable fictions than actually protecting people. She gestured toward the trading house. Come inside. If you're actually offering cooperation against Valdris, we should discuss terms before the next raid arrives. The interior was functional rather than comfortable. Maps covering walls alongside inventory logs and communication schedules. Kira moved through the space with practiced efficiency, pouring drinks and indicating chairs in single fluid motion. 2 other people joined them, both carrying themselves with combat experience that read as professional rather than improvised. Kira introduced them as Vale and Marcus, her senior advisors on military and logistical matters, respectively. Tell me what you know about Valdris operations. Kira settled into her chair with attention that would catalog every detail. Complete assessment, nothing held back for negotiating leverage. Kaedric spent the next hour outlining everything Matthias's intelligence contained, alongside tactical observations from the defensive engagement. He presented information with clinical precision, making no attempt to minimize his role in the network's catastrophic failure or exaggerate his capability for future operations. Kira listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, her expression revealing nothing until Kaedric finished. Then she leaned back, considered him with evaluation that felt like scalpel work, and spoke with brutal honesty. You're competent, experienced, and demonstrably willing to make terrible choices when the mathematics demand it. Also catastrophically bad at detecting internal betrayal, prone to philosophical crisis that interferes with operational efficiency, and carrying enough psychological damage that trusting your judgment long-term is questionable at best. That's accurate assessment. Kaedric appreciated the honesty even as it landed like physical impact. Though I'd add that I am actively trying to develop better detection protocols, and the philosophical crisis is feature rather than bug, uncomfortable reminder that calculation alone is insufficient framework for decisions that matter beyond pure tactical outcome. Kira's smile was sharp and approving. Most people in your position would defend themselves or minimize the failures. You just acknowledged them and explained why they might actually be advantages in specific contexts. That's either remarkable self-awareness or sophisticated manipulation. Both, probably. Kaedric met her stare directly. I'm genuinely trying to build something that doesn't consume itself through internal contradictions. But I'm also trying to survive and recruit people with resources I need for that rebuilding. Hard to separate honest self-assessment from strategic presentation when both serve overlapping objectives. Vale spoke for the first time, his voice carrying accent that suggested southern provinces originally. What do you actually want from us? Specifically, beyond vague cooperation against shared threats. Intelligence network across your 17 settlements. Kaedric had already run the calculations, understanding exactly what he needed and what he could offer in exchange. Coordinated early warning system for Valdris movements, shared assessment of their operational patterns, combined defensive planning that doesn't rely on Crown forces arriving in time to matter. In exchange, I provide tactical consultation, strategic planning, and willingness to make choices that official authority can't acknowledge, but everyone benefits from when executed properly. You're describing shadow governance. Marcus's tone carried no judgment, just observation. Parallel power structure that operates outside Crown authority but serves similar functions through different methodology. I'm describing pragmatic response to institutional failure. Kaedric's correction was gentle. Crown authority functions adequately when threats fit established categories and response timelines. When problems require immediate action or uncomfortable choices, official channels become obstacles rather than solutions. Someone has to fill that gap. And you believe you're qualified for that role? Kira's challenge was direct. Despite recent evidence suggesting your judgment is flawed and your operations vulnerable to catastrophic compromise. No. The admission emerged more honest than comfortable. I believe I'm willing to attempt the role despite those flaws, which is different from claiming qualification. I believe someone has to make these choices, and I'm marginally more competent than the alternatives currently available. And I believe that acknowledging my limitations while still engaging is preferable to either arrogant certainty or paralyzed inaction. The silence that followed carried weight. 3 experienced operators evaluating whether his framework was functional pragmatism or elaborate self-justification. Kira stood abruptly, moving to the maps that dominated one wall. These are documented Valdris movements over the past 2 months. Raiders hit 8 settlements in patterns that suggest systematic infrastructure mapping. They're not just preparing invasion, they're establishing occupation framework that can activate the moment Crown forces are eliminated or withdrawn. She traced routes with methodical precision, showing coordination that required professional military planning. If they invade within next 2 months, before snow closes the northern passes completely, Crown response will be delayed until spring. 6 months of Valdris occupation becomes entrenched enough that reclamation requires full military. Campaign with casualties the Crown won't accept for territories they've essentially abandoned already. So the northern provinces get sacrificed to avoid expensive war. Kaedric understood the calculation immediately, had run similar assessments himself when serving Crown interests. Valdris gains territory, Crown avoids costly conflict, and everyone living here either submits to new governance or dies resisting occupation that official authority won't challenge. Exactly. Kira returned to her seat, expression carrying fury beneath professional control. Which means we have maybe 6 weeks to disrupt Valdris operations sufficiently that invasion becomes tactically unsound or politically untenable. After that, we're just documenting our own conquest. Can't be done with current resources. Vale's assessment was blunt. We're coordinating 17 settlements with combined defensive capability of maybe 200 combatants, most with minimal training. Valdris is fielding professional military force with external support and strategic coordination. Mathematics don't favor resistance. Mathematics rarely favor the people who need them most. Kaedric felt familiar calculation engage, tactical mind processing variables into operational frameworks. But mathematics also create vulnerabilities when you understand how your opponent is running their own numbers. Valdris is optimizing for efficient conquest with minimal casualties. That optimization creates patterns we can exploit. How? Marcus leaned forward, professional interest overriding skepticism. Kaedric moved to the maps, studying documented movements with systematic attention. Valdris operations follow predictable cadence, raids every 7 to 10 days, rotating between settlement clusters to prevent coordinated response. They're maintaining pressure while mapping infrastructure, classic preparation for rapid occupation once invasion commences. He traced probable staging areas, supply routes, command positions. Their efficiency creates dependency on specific logistical frameworks. Supply caches positioned for operational support. Communication networks coordinating raid timing. Command structure that requires central coordination to maintain systematic approach. You're describing decapitation strategy. Kira's voice carried understanding. Eliminate their command and logistical capability. Force them into reactive chaos instead of coordinated execution. More specifically, I'm describing making their optimization into liability. Kedric's smile was cold. They've built operations that function brilliantly when variables remain controlled. We introduce chaos that breaks their calculation framework. Force them into situations where efficiency becomes impossible and adaptation requires resources they haven't allocated for contingency. That requires intelligence we don't have. Vale's objection was practical. We know where they've raided, but not where they're staging or how they're coordinating. So we force them to reveal it. Kaedric returned to his seat, mind accelerating through operational possibilities. We create threat that demands centralized response. Something significant enough that their command structure has to engage directly rather than delegating to raid elements. When they commit to that response, we track them back to staging areas and eliminate operational capability before they can adapt. You're describing using ourselves as bait again. Jace's voice emerged quiet but certain. Same strategy that got Torval and Lysa killed. Same category of strategy with significant modifications based on lessons learned from previous catastrophic failure. Kaedric met the kid's stare directly. This time we control variables more carefully, verify loyalty before committing to engagement, and maintain genuine fallback positions rather than assuming reinforcement that might not materialize. The fundamental problem remains. Kira's assessment cut through tactical details to core issue. You're asking us to risk resources on operation led by someone whose last major engagement ended in complete disaster. Why should we trust your strategic judgment when recent evidence suggests it's fatally flawed? The question deserved honest answer rather than defensive justification. You shouldn't trust my judgment automatically. Kaedric kept his voice level despite everything inside him screaming that this conversation determined whether he'd spend remaining years attempting rebuilding or simply disappearing into wilderness. You should verify every assessment I provide, question every operational decision, maintain independent evaluation of whether my calculations serve collective interest or just my own psychological need to believe competence matters, despite accumulating failures. He paused, meeting each person's eyes in turn. But you should also recognize that I'm the only person currently available who combines military training, strategic experience, and willingness to make terrible choices while acknowledging they're terrible rather than pretending institutional authority makes violence legitimate. You need someone who can calculate how to disrupt Valdris operations. I need people who'll prevent me from consuming everyone who trusts those calculations through my own blind spots and damaged judgment. That's not inspiring confidence. Marcus's tone was dry. That's admitting you're fundamentally unreliable while asking us to depend on you anyway. Yes. Kaedric's smile was tired. Because inspiration and confidence are what people sell when they need you to stop questioning their authority. I'm offering functional cooperation between flawed people attempting to solve problems that don't have comfortable solutions. Take it or leave it, but make the choice based on accurate assessment rather than comforting fictions about leadership competence. Kira exchanged glances with Vale and Marcus, silent communication flowing through micro-expressions and subtle gestures. Then she returned attention to Kaedric with decision that had clearly been reached. We'll coordinate initial intelligence gathering, shared observation of Valdris movements, combined assessment of their operational patterns, verification of your tactical analysis before committing to any engagement. If your calculations prove accurate and your judgment remains functional, we escalate to actual operational planning. And if my calculations are wrong or judgment fails, then we cut ties before your catastrophic failures consume our resources alongside your own. Kira's honesty was brutal and necessary. We're not signing on for blind loyalty or institutional hierarchy. This is professional cooperation that continues as long as mutual benefit remains clear and terminates the moment cost exceeds value. That's the only kind of arrangement that actually functions in this context. Kedrick extended his hand across the table. Welcome to governance beyond comfortable authority, where trust requires constant verification and loyalty has built-in expiration dates. Kira gripped his hand firmly, seal on agreement that acknowledged its own fragility. They spent the next 3 weeks building intelligence network that operated through systematic verification rather than assumed trust. Kedrick coordinated observers across Kira's 17 settlements, establishing communication protocols and pattern analysis frameworks that treated every report as potentially compromised until confirmed through independent sources. Jace proved surprisingly competent at recruitment and training, the kid's recent experience with betrayal making him naturally suspicious in ways that served operational security. He built verification systems that required multiple confirmation points before intelligence was considered actionable, preventing single-source manipulation that had enabled Marin's coordination with Valdris. The network grew carefully, adding individuals who demonstrated capability through specific actions, rather than accepting volunteers based on stated commitment. Kedrick interviewed every potential recruit personally, looking for patterns that suggested genuine alignment versus infiltration attempts. He found 3 probable Valdris operatives in the first week, people whose stories contained inconsistencies or whose backgrounds didn't survive detailed verification. Rather than eliminating them violently, he fed them false intelligence about defensive preparations and tracked where that information surfaced in subsequent Valdris operations. The pattern that emerged confirmed his assessment of how their command structure functioned. Centralized coordination that required regular communication, systematic intelligence processing that followed predictable analytical frameworks, operational planning that optimized for efficiency at the expense of adaptability, standard military excellence that created exactly the vulnerabilities Kedrick needed to exploit. By the end of 3rd week, he had comprehensive picture of Valdris operations. Staging area located in Mountain Valley, 40 miles north of the settlement cluster. Supply routes running through 3 primary passes. Communication network using signal stations that required line-of-sight coordination. Command element consisting of approximately 12 senior officers directing raid operations and preparing invasion logistics. The intelligence was solid, verified through multiple independent sources, and confirmed by captured documents from a raid that Kira's forces had ambushed successfully. Kedrick assembled the core coordination group in Kira's trading house, spreading maps and documentation across tables with systematic thoroughness. This is what we're facing. He outlined Valdris capabilities with clinical precision. Professional military force numbering approximately 300 combatants, with another 200 in logistical support roles. They're planning invasion within 4 weeks, targeting occupation before winter makes Crown response impossible until spring. We can't match that force directly. Vale's assessment was immediate and accurate. Even if we coordinated every settlement's defensive capability, we're looking at 200 combatants with mixed training against their 300 professionals. Mathematics don't favor engagement. Direct engagement loses. Kedrick agreed without hesitation, which is why we're not engaging directly. We're eliminating their operational capability through surgical strikes that destroy their logistical framework and command structure simultaneously. He traced attack vectors on the map with methodical precision. 3 teams. First team hits their primary supply cache here, destroying stockpiled resources they've accumulated for invasion support. Second team takes out the signal station network, eliminating their communication coordination. Third team eliminates command element while they're responding to the first 2 attacks and operating without effective coordination. That's suicide mathematics. Marcus's objection was blunt. You're describing simultaneous operations against defended positions with forces we're still assembling and training. Casualties would be catastrophic even if everything functioned perfectly. Casualties will be significant. Kedrick didn't minimize the cost, probably 30 to 40% of engaged forces. But that's preferable to waiting for invasion that will kill significantly more people and establish occupation we can't dislodge without Crown intervention that isn't coming. You're asking people to volunteer for operations where 1 in 3 won't survive. Kira's voice carried something complex beneath professional assessment. That's different from defensive action where casualties are unfortunate outcome. This is deliberately choosing to sacrifice specific percentages of our forces. Yes. Kadrick met her stare without flinching. Because the alternative is accepting invasion that kills higher percentages of civilian population and establishes governance that treats northern territories as conquered provinces rather than disputed borders. Someone has to run the mathematics and make the choice. I'm willing to be that person if you're willing to verify the calculation is accurate. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with recognition that this was the fundamental decision point. Whether to accept Kadrick's framework and commit to operations that required conscious sacrifice, or reject the mathematics and hope for alternatives that probably didn't exist. Kira spoke slowly, each word carrying weight of leadership that understood consequences. I'll coordinate volunteers from the settlements, people who understand the choice and accept the mathematics consciously. But I want absolute clarity about what we're attempting. This isn't heroic resistance or justified defense. This is deliberate violence calculated to achieve strategic objectives through acceptable casualties. That's accurate description. Kadrick appreciated the honesty, even as it made the choice feel heavier. And anyone who volunteers deserves that same clarity. No comfortable fictions about glory or necessity. Just honest assessment of what the operation requires and what survival probability looks like. They spent the next week recruiting and training, building 3 strike teams from volunteers who'd chosen engagement after understanding exactly what the mathematics demanded. Kadrick led the command elimination team personally, recognizing that his strategic assessment required him to bear the highest risk portion of operations he'd designed. Jace insisted on joining that team despite Kadrick's objection, the kid's argument simple and devastating. You taught me that competence requires accepting consequences of your calculations. If you're right about this operation, I want to learn from someone who actually survives their strategic decisions. If you're wrong, I'd rather die alongside you than spend the rest of my life wondering if better leadership would have made the difference. The night before deployment, Kadrick found himself unable to sleep despite exhaustion demanding rest. He reviewed operational plans with obsessive thoroughness, checking details that had already been verified multiple times, looking for the variables that would transform carefully calculation into catastrophic failure. Kira found him near midnight, carrying a bottle of actual alcohol rather than the terrible pine needle tea that had defined northern hospitality. You're going to exhaust yourself before the engagement even starts. She poured 2 measures with practiced efficiency. Learn to trust your preparation and conserve energy for when the mathematics actually matter. Last time I trusted my preparation, everyone who depended on it died buying time for my escape. Kadrick accepted the drink, grateful for warmth that cut through the cold gnawing at his chest. Forgive me if I'm hesitant to repeat that particular experience. You learned from the failure. Kira's voice carried certainty. Changed your verification protocols, built redundant intelligence systems, maintained skepticism about assumed loyalty. That's what competence actually looks like in this profession. Not avoiding mistakes, but adapting frameworks based on what disasters teach you. She settled beside him, both of them studying maps that had been examined until the details blurred into abstract patterns. Vale asked me why I'm trusting you after the network collapse. Said your strategic judgment is demonstrably flawed, and your psychological damage makes you fundamentally unreliable for long-term operations. What did you tell him? Kadrick was genuinely curious. That flawed and damaged is baseline condition for anyone who takes this work seriously. Kira's smile was tired. That perfect strategic judgment is fiction people maintain until reality forces them to acknowledge humans are fundamentally limited, and that I'd rather work with someone who recognizes their flaws and compensates consciously than someone who believes their competence is unquestionable. She paused, considering the maps. Also told him that you're the only person I've encountered who combines tactical brilliance with genuine horror at its own calculations. Most commanders either embrace the violence or pretend it's somehow justified by institutional authority. You acknowledge it's terrible and choose it anyway because the alternatives are worse. That's rare enough to be worth the risk. The compliment landed harder than criticism would have, cutting through defenses Kadrick had constructed around the fundamental question of whether his framework was functional or just sophisticated self-deception. Don't make me regret that assessment. Kira stood, preparing to return to her own preparations. Survive tomorrow's operation and prove that competence combined with conscience is actually possible, rather than contradiction that consumes everyone who attempts it. She left him alone with alcohol and maps and the weight of leadership that had somehow accumulated despite his best efforts to avoid institutional authority. Dawn arrived with brutal clarity, sky so bright it hurt despite the cold that made breathing painful. The three strike teams assembled with quiet efficiency, final equipment checks and position confirmations completing without unnecessary conversation. Kaedric addressed them before departure, knowing words mattered less than demonstrated action, but recognizing that people deserved acknowledgement of what they were choosing. You volunteered for this, knowing the mathematics. His voice carried across assembled forces with authority that hadn't diminished despite exile and failure. 1 in 3 of you won't survive the next 12 hours. Those who do survive will live with memories of violence that don't fade with time or justify themselves through comfortable distance. He paused, meeting eyes across the formation. I can't promise your sacrifice serves greater good, or that history will remember you as heroes rather than criminals who operated beyond legitimate authority. All I can promise is that I've calculated this operation as carefully as I know how, that I'm risking my own life on the same mathematics I'm asking you to trust, and that if we succeed, we prevent invasion that would kill significantly more people than our acceptable casualties. Take that for what it's worth. And if you're having second thoughts, withdraw now without judgment. Better to admit uncertainty than die committed to choice you didn't actually believe in. No one moved. The strike teams deployed at noon, moving through terrain that offered concealment at the cost of speed. Kaedric led his command elimination team along the most dangerous approach vector, accepting the highest risk because his calculation demanded it. They reached final positions as afternoon light began failing, close enough to Valdris' command element to hear conversations and smell cooking fires. The enemy showed no indication of heightened alert, professional confidence making them assume their operational security remained intact. Kaedric checked timing one final time, confirming the supply team and communication team were positioned for simultaneous engagement. The coordination was tight, requiring precise execution with minimal room for adaptation if anything delayed. Standard impossible operation that required everything functioning perfectly, despite humans being fundamentally imperfect. He gave the signal. 3 separate engagements erupted simultaneously 40 miles apart, coordinated violence designed to shatter Valdris' operational capacity through synchronized disruption. Kaedric's team hit the command element with concentrated fury, crossbow fire eliminating sentries before alarm could raise properly. They moved through defensive positions with practiced efficiency, each member executing a assigned role with competence that came from understanding exactly what failure meant. The Valdris commanders responded with professional discipline, organizing defensive response despite surprise and confusion. They were good, trained soldiers who'd survived multiple campaigns through skill and coordination. But Kaedric had spent 2 decades studying how military organizations functioned and exactly where their systematic excellence created vulnerabilities. He'd calculated the attack vectors that would maximize disruption, identified the command personnel whose elimination would cascade into organizational collapse, and positioned his forces to exploit the brief window before adaptation could occur. The engagement was brutal and efficient, close-quarters violence where individual skill mattered less than collective execution. Bodies fell on both sides. Mathematics of combat reducing humans to casualty statistics with familiar horror. Kaedric fought with mechanical precision, sword work that had once made him legendary transformed into necessary violence that kept him alive through moments where calculation alone would have failed. Around him, Jace and the others held positions with desperate competence, making Valdris pay for every yard gained through casualties that mounted faster than their commanders could adjust tactics. The command element collapsed within 20 minutes. Senior officers dead or captured, organizational structure disrupted beyond immediate repair. Kaedric's team withdrew through prepared positions, carrying their wounded and leaving devastation that would require days to reconstruct. They reached the rally point 2 hours after engagement concluded, exhausted and wounded but functional. The casualties had been significant, 8 dead and 12 injured from 40-person strike team. 20% losses, lower than projected but still devastating to people who'd trusted his calculations. The supply team arrived 30 minutes later, reporting successful destruction of primary cache with 15% casualties. The communication team had sustained heavier losses, 25% dead or seriously wounded, but had eliminated the signal station network completely. Kira coordinated the withdrawal with systematic efficiency, moving all 3 teams toward defensive positions, while Valdris forces attempted to respond to simultaneous disasters without effective command coordination. They'd succeeded. The operation had functioned approximately as calculated, disrupting Valdris' capability through acceptable casualties that would prevent invasion within the timeline that had threatened northern territories. But acceptable was mathematical language that didn't quite capture what it felt like to count bodies of people who'd volunteered based on trust in Kaedric's strategic assessment. To see Jace binding wounds on teammates who'd survived by margins too narrow to calculate reliably. To understand that his competence had purchased invasion prevention through conscious sacrifice of specific percentages of human lives. To recognize that he'd become exactly what the tribunal had feared when they'd exiled him. Someone capable of running terrible mathematics and executing them efficiently enough to call it strategy rather than acknowledging the horror. They established defensive positions in the settlement cluster, preparing for potential Valdris retaliation, while intelligence confirmed the full impact of their operations. The reports that filtered back over the next 3 days painted a picture of enemy forces in complete disarray, command structure collapsed, and logistical framework destroyed beyond rapid reconstruction. The invasion timeline had been shattered. Valdris would need months to rebuild operational capability, by which point winter would make campaign impossible, and Crown forces might actually respond to documented evidence of coordinated military operations. The Northern Territories had been saved through violence, calculated precisely enough to prevent the worst violence that invasion would have inflicted. Kaedric should have felt vindicated, should have recognized this as proof that his framework functioned. The competence combined with conscience could produce outcomes that mattered beyond pure strategic value. Instead, he felt hollow, exhausted beyond physical damage, standing in settlement centers surrounded by people celebrating survival while he counted the cost and questioned whether the mathematics had truly justified their price. Kira found him near the wounded, watching healers work with practiced efficiency on injuries that would leave permanent scars. "You did it." Her voice carried something complex beneath professional assessment. Disrupted Valdris operations, prevented invasion, saved significantly more lives than the operation cost. This is what tactical brilliance looks like when actually executed properly. 23 dead. Kaedric's voice came out flat. 23 people who volunteered based on trust in calculations I'm still not certain were correct versus convenient. The mathematics were sound. Kira's certainty didn't waver. Invasion would have killed hundreds, established occupation that would have brutalized everyone living here. You chose the option that minimized total casualties while achieving strategic objectives. That's what leadership requires in spaces where all choices are terrible. Then why does it feel like I just purchased victory through sacrifice I had no right to demand? Because you're not a sociopath. Kira's smile was sad and knowing. Because you understand that mathematics describe outcomes, but don't quite capture what it means to make choices that kill people who trusted you. That's the permanent condition of anyone who takes this work seriously. The calculations are correct, and the horror remains. She moved to leave, then paused. Valdris is sending negotiators, arriving tomorrow under flag of truce. They want to discuss terms that prevent escalation to full warfare while acknowledging their invasion timeline is broken beyond repair. So we won. Kaedric processed the information with tactical mind that couldn't quite stop calculating. They're accepting that Northern Territories aren't worth the cost of continued operations. We won this engagement. Kira's correction was gentle. Whether you won the larger question about competence and conscience is something you'll spend the rest of your life determining through continued choices and their consequences. The negotiation occurred in Kira's trading house, formal meeting between Valdris representatives and the coordination network that had destroyed their operational planning. Kaedric attended as tactical consultant, positioned to provide strategic assessment without claiming authority he hadn't earned. The Valdris delegation was led by a woman who introduced herself as Colonel Cirrus Kane, senior intelligence officer who'd apparently survived the command element elimination through being positioned elsewhere during the engagement. She studied Kaedric's with assessment that suggested complete familiarity with his background and recent actions. Duke Thornhart. Her voice carried professional respect beneath hostile positioning. Your reputation suggested competence, but I hadn't anticipated brilliance. 3 simultaneous strikes executed with precision that would impress formal military command, all coordinated by exiled noblemen operating with minimal resources and compromised network. I had excellent advisors and people willing to execute operations despite justified uncertainty about my leadership. Kaedric kept his tone neutral, refusing to claim credit that belonged to people who'd borne the actual risk. What terms is Valdris proposing? Recognition of Northern Territories as disputed zone rather than crown possession. Cirrus outlined framework with diplomatic precision. We withdraw forces, suspend raiding operations, and establish formal communication protocols for resolving border incidents. In exchange, you don't provide Crown intelligence about our invasion preparation or document our operations in ways that would justify their military response. You're asking us to help you avoid consequences for attempting conquest. Vale's objection was immediate. While providing nothing except promise not to continue doing what we've already made tactically impossible. We're offering stability. Cyrus's correction was smooth. Continued conflict benefits no one. Crown won't defend these territories adequately, our invasion timeline is broken, and everyone living here just wants to survive without being caught between competing powers. This framework allows that. Kedrick listened to negotiation proceed, his tactical mind evaluating terms against strategic objectives and probable outcomes. The offer was reasonable by most assessments, providing security that Crown authority wouldn't deliver while avoiding escalation that served no one's interests. But reasonable didn't quite address the fundamental question about whether accepting those terms meant enabling future aggression or pragmatically acknowledging political realities that existed, regardless of moral preferences. Kira called for brief recess, pulling core coordination group into private consultation. What's your assessment? She addressed Kedrick directly. You designed the operations that created this negotiating position. Does accepting their terms serve our objectives, or just postpone problems we'll face again once they've rebuilt capability? Kedrick considered the question with systematic thoroughness, running calculations that felt increasingly inadequate for decisions that mattered beyond pure tactical outcomes. Their proposal provides short-term stability at the cost of legitimizing Valdris' presence in disputed territories. We're acknowledging they have claim to areas Crown has essentially abandoned, which sets precedent for future negotiations. But the alternative is continued conflict we probably can't sustain without resources we don't have, and Crown support that isn't materializing. He paused, recognizing the actual choice beneath diplomatic language. This is the same mathematics I've been running since exile began, accepting terrible options because the alternatives are worse while questioning whether that justification is accurate or just sophisticated self-deception that makes necessary evil feel like tactical brilliance. And what do you recommend? Kira's question was direct. Despite your uncertainty about frameworks, what does your actual judgment suggest? Accept their terms with modifications that require verification and maintain our operational capability. Kedrick delivered the assessment with honesty about its limitations. Build in monitoring protocols that detect if they're using stability to prepare renewed operations. Maintain defensive coordination that can respond if the framework collapses. Trust the mathematics while acknowledging they might be wrong and preparing for that possibility. That's not confident leadership. Marcus's observation was accurate. That's hedged uncertainty that admits your own calculation might fail catastrophically. Yes. Kedrick met his stare directly. Because confident leadership is what people perform when they need you to stop questioning whether the mathematics actually justify their authority. I'm offering functional framework that acknowledges limitations while still providing direction. Take it or leave it, but make the choice based on accurate assessment of what I'm actually capable of delivering. The negotiation concluded with terms that incorporated Kedrick's modifications, creating framework that provided stability while maintaining verification capability. Valdris withdrew forces, suspended operations, and established communication protocols that would hopefully prevent future escalation. The Northern Territories achieved something approximating peace through violence calculated precisely enough to make continued conflict tactically unsound for all parties. And Kedrick stood in the aftermath, wondering if he'd just prevented catastrophe or simply delayed it through choices that would eventually consume everything he'd attempted to protect. 3 weeks after the negotiations concluded, messenger arrived from the south carrying sealed letter with wax stamp Kedrick recognized immediately. Seraphine Korvath's personal seal, purple and silver that marked correspondence from someone who'd rebuilt her destroyed house into political force that made kingdoms recalculate their strategic positioning. He opened it with hands that had steadied through force of will, reading her elegant script by firelight that made the words dance across vision. Kedrick, word reached me about your northern operations, preventing Valdris invasion while operating with minimal resources and compromised network structure is impressive even by your catastrophically high standards for tactical brilliance combined with personal damage. I'm writing to inform you that certain Crown officials have noticed your continued existence and effectiveness. They're experiencing mixed emotions about exiled Duke, who's apparently more functional beyond their authority than he was while serving it officially. Also writing to warn you that Marin Blackthorn has surfaced in the capital, offering her services as coordinator between Crown interests and Northern territories. She's positioning herself as alternative governance framework, someone who can provide stability through cooperation rather than your confrontational independence. She's building support among officials who find your honesty about power uncomfortable and prefer working with people who maintain comfortable fictions about institutional legitimacy, which means you have approximately 6 months before Crown attempts to either eliminate you as destabilizing influence or force you into cooperation that neutralizes your independence. Probably both simultaneously if they can arrange it. I'm not warning you out of nostalgia for our complicated history. I'm warning you because the work you're attempting matters, and I'd prefer it continue despite your psychological damage and catastrophic judgment failures. Consider this official notice that your exile period is approaching critical decision point. You can continue building independent operations until Crown authority moves against you with resources you can't match. You can disappear into deeper wilderness and abandon everything you've constructed. Or you can return to civilization on terms that might allow actual influence rather than perpetual exile. None of these options are comfortable. All of them require choosing between contradictory priorities and accepting consequences you can't fully calculate in advance. Welcome to permanent condition of anyone attempting to function with competence and conscience in spaces where power demands terrible choices. Respond. If you want to coordinate actual strategy, rather than simply waiting for Crown to force your decision through circumstances you didn't choose. Seraphine. Kadric read the letter 3 times, each iteration cutting deeper through the framework he'd been constructing around Northern operations and independent governance beyond institutional authority. He'd spent months building something that functioned despite catastrophic failures, creating coordination networks that acknowledged betrayal and required verification, developing capability that prevented invasion through calculated violence. And now Seraphine was informing him that success had made him threatening enough that Crown authority would move to eliminate or control the operations he'd designed. That Marin had positioned herself as alternative, offering cooperation that maintained comfortable fictions Kadric refused to perform. That everything he'd built was approaching decision point where he'd have to choose between continued independence that couldn't sustain itself against Crown resources, or some form of engagement that would compromise the very principles that made his operations functional. The mathematics were brutal and clear. He couldn't maintain Northern operations indefinitely against combined opposition from Marin's political positioning and Crown authorities' eventual intervention. The resources weren't adequate. The support structure was too fragile, and his own psychological damage made sustained leadership increasingly questionable. But abandoning everything he'd built meant accepting that competence combined with conscience was impossible in practice, that the contradiction between ruthless calculation and expensive mercy couldn't be held by anyone attempting to function in spaces where power demanded terrible choices, meant surrendering to the same comfortable fictions he'd been fighting since exile began, pretending that institutional authority made violence legitimate and that following orders eliminated personal responsibility for their execution. Meant becoming either the monster who embraced efficient brutality or the coward who refused to engage because all available choices felt inadequate. Kadric stood alone in the Northern darkness, holding Seraphine's letter and the weight of decisions that would determine not just his future, but the fundamental nature of everything he'd become since that morning when the gallows had collapsed and given him time to choose what kind of person he'd be when forced beyond the boundaries of comfortable authority. And somewhere in the space between wilderness and civilization, between mathematics and meaning, between exile and engagement, Duke Kadric Thornheart understood with absolute clarity that whatever choice he made in the coming hours would commit him to path with. No remaining exits and no possibility of comfortable certainty about whether the mathematics actually justified their terrible cost. Kadric spent 7 days alone in the northern wilderness before responding to Seraphine's letter. 7 days walking terrain that had witnessed his transformation from exiled Duke to something he still couldn't quite define without feeling like he was lying to himself about fundamental nature. The landscape offered no answers, just endless cold and silence that forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding through operational urgency and tactical focus. What did he actually want beyond pure survival? What was he building toward, if not comfortable fiction that competence justified its own costs? What distinguished his framework from the institutional authority he'd rejected if both required violence calculated precisely enough to call it strategy rather than acknowledging the horror? The questions circled like carrion birds, patient and relentless, waiting for him to exhaust himself into surrender or breakthrough. He found neither, just gradual recognition that maybe the uncertainty itself was the answer. That permanent questioning prevented the comfortable certainty that transformed necessary evil into casual brutality. That holding contradictions without resolving them was the actual work rather than temporary state before achieving clarity. On the 8th day, he returned to the settlement cluster and drafted his response to Seraphine with hands that had steadied through acceptance rather than confidence. The letter was brief, stripped of diplomatic language or strategic positioning, just honest assessment of what he could offer and what he needed in exchange. He sent it south with the messenger who'd proven reliable through demonstrated action rather than stated loyalty, then waited for response that would determine whether his framework could function within civilization or only beyond its boundaries. The waiting was worse than combat, endless days where every variable remained uncontrolled and every calculation incomplete. Kaedric occupied himself with network coordination, building verification systems and training protocols that would hopefully survive his departure if Crown Authority forced that outcome. Jace watched him with visible concern, the kid's youth not preventing accurate assessment of deteriorating psychological state. "You're preparing for your own absence." His observation was delivered without judgment during routine equipment inspection, building everything to function without you, like you're expecting to disappear or die and want the work to continue regardless. Planning for contingencies is basic operational practice. Kaedric kept his tone neutral, despite the accuracy cutting deeper than comfortable. Leaders who build systems dependent on their continued presence create catastrophic vulnerabilities when circumstances inevitably remove them. That's tactically sound and emotionally devastating. Jace set aside the crossbow he'd been maintaining. "You're treating yourself as expendable variable in calculations you've designed. That's not leadership. That's elaborate suicide through strategic framework." The accusation landed with force that made Kaedric pause mid-motion, recognition settling like weight across his shoulders. Because the kid was right. He'd been constructing operational frameworks that assumed his own elimination as likely outcome, building everything to continue functioning after he was removed through Crown intervention, or Marin's political maneuvering, or simple exhaustion from maintaining impossible contradictions. Had been treating his survival as secondary concern compared to network continuity, prioritizing system resilience over personal preservation in ways that felt like tactical wisdom, but might just be sophisticated self-destruction. What would you recommend? The question emerged more honest than intended, since apparently my judgment about my own value is questionable at best. Stop building for your absence and start building for your continued presence. Jace's response was immediate. Accept that people have chosen to work with you despite your flaws, rather than treating yourself as temporary placeholder until better leadership arrives. Acknowledge that surviving matters beyond pure strategic calculation. He paused, meeting Kaedric's stare with intensity that came from genuine concern rather than tactical assessment. "You taught me that choices matter even when all options are terrible. That calculation without conscience is efficient evil, but conscience without calculation is useless virtue. Now I'm teaching you that surviving your own framework matters, because the work needs people who hold those contradictions honestly, rather than just designing systems that eliminate the need for human judgment." The words settled into silence that stretched between them, weighted with recognition that the student had identified blind spot the teacher couldn't see from inside his own damaged perspective. Kaedric was saved from having to respond by arrival of messenger from the south, exhausted rider carrying sealed correspondence that bore multiple stamps suggesting passage through several verification checkpoints. He opened Seraphine's response with hands that trembled fractionally, despite disciplined control, reading her elegant script with attention that cataloged every word for implications and unstated meanings. "Kaedric, your letter was characteristically honest about limitations and distressingly vague about actual intentions. I'm choosing to interpret this as strategic caution rather than genuine uncertainty about what you want, because the alternative suggests psychological deterioration that makes you useless for the coordination I'm proposing. Crown officials are divided about your continued existence. Conservatives want you eliminated as destabilizing influence, who demonstrates that competence functions better without institutional oversight. Progressives see opportunity to leverage your capabilities while containing your independence through frameworks that provide resources in exchange for accountability. I've been building coalition among the progressives, positioning your northern operations as model for governance that acknowledges power's requirements without pretending institutional authority makes violence legitimate. It's delicate work that requires you to actually cooperate rather than maintaining proud isolation that serves your damaged ego more than practical objectives. Here's what I'm offering. Return to civilization under terms that preserve your operational independence while establishing coordination with Crown interests. You maintain command authority over northern territories, but you report intelligence and coordinate major operations through channels I'll establish. You get resources and legitimacy. Crown gets stability and capability. They can't develop internally. In exchange, you accept oversight that prevents the catastrophic judgment failures your recent history demonstrates you're vulnerable to. You submit operational plans for review before execution. You build verification systems that detect internal betrayal before it consumes everyone who trusts you. You acknowledge that surviving matters and stop treating yourself as expendable variable in calculations you've designed. This isn't comfortable offer or one that preserves your independence completely. It's pragmatic framework that allows your competence to function within civilization rather than only beyond its boundaries. You have 3 weeks to decide. After that, political circumstances change in ways that make this coordination impossible, and Crown moves to eliminate you as threat they can't control or utilize. Respond with actual decision rather than philosophical uncertainty. I need to know if you're choosing engagement or exile, cooperation or isolation, survival or elaborate self-destruction through strategic framework. Seraphine. The letter contained secondary document, formal proposal, outlining governance structure with legal precision that made the arrangement feel simultaneously legitimate and constraining. Kaedric studied it with systematic thoroughness, noting provisions and limitations with tactical mind that couldn't quite stop calculating whether the framework enabled his objectives or just controlled them through comfortable language. Kira found him 3 hours later, still reviewing documentation with obsessive attention that suggested he'd read the same paragraphs multiple times without processing their actual content. You're spiraling. Her assessment was blunt. Overthinking decision that's actually straightforward if you stop treating every choice as existential crisis that defines your fundamental nature. This decision does define fundamental nature. Kaedric set aside the documents with visible reluctance. Accepting Seraphine's framework means acknowledging that independent operations can't sustain themselves against institutional resources. That cooperation with authority I've rejected is necessary for continued function. That my entire framework about operating beyond comfortable fictions requires compromise to remain viable. Or it means acknowledging that purity is luxury you can't afford when the work actually matters. Kira settled into the chair across from him with familiar ease. That survival requires accepting help, even when the terms aren't perfect. That building something sustainable is more important than maintaining ideological consistency about operational independence. She leaned forward, expression carrying intensity that demanded his full attention. You've spent months proving that competence combined with conscience can function in spaces where power demands terrible choices. You've prevented invasion, established stability, and built coordination networks that acknowledge betrayal without becoming paralyzed by suspicion. That's remarkable achievement that deserves continuation rather than abandonment because the framework requires modification. What are you actually afraid of? That accepting oversight means losing the independence that makes you functional? Or that cooperation might reveal your entire rejection of institutional authority was just damaged response to being exiled rather than principled stance about governance? The question cut deeper than Kaedric wanted to acknowledge, exposing the uncertainty beneath tactical calculations and strategic assessments. Because Kira was right, part of him feared that accepting Seraphine's framework would prove his exile had been about wounded pride rather than genuine philosophical difference with how power functioned. That his northern operations were elaborate performance designed to prove the tribunal wrong rather than actual attempt to build something better. That everything he'd constructed was just sophisticated self-deception, sophisticated enough to fool even himself about underlying motivations. I don't know if I'm building something that matters, or just avoiding admission that I was wrong about fundamental assumptions. The confession emerged more raw than intended. Don't know if accepting cooperation serves the work, or just proves I can't function without institutional support. I've spent months claiming was unnecessary. Then stop trying to achieve perfect certainty before making decisions. Kira's smile was sympathetic and hard. Accept that you'll spend the rest of your life questioning whether your choices are correct or just convenient. That's permanent condition of anyone attempting honest engagement with power's contradictions. She stood, preparing to leave him with his spiral and documentation. 3 weeks isn't long for decision this significant, but it's adequate time to recognize that survival requires choosing imperfect engagement over pure isolation. Make the choice based on what actually serves the work, rather than what preserves your damaged ego's need for ideological consistency. Kadrick spent the next 2 weeks consulting with everyone whose judgment he'd learned to value through demonstrated competence rather than assumed authority. Vale argued for accepting the framework, practical assessment, that independent operations couldn't sustain themselves indefinitely against combined opposition. Marcus worried about compromise that would gradually erode operational independence until Kadrick became functionally indistinguishable from Crown officials he'd rejected. Jay simply asked what choice would allow him to continue learning from someone who held contradictions honestly rather than resolving them through comfortable certainty. The perspectives accumulated without reaching consensus, different people prioritizing different variables in calculations that resisted objective optimization. But through the consultations, pattern emerged that Kadrick couldn't quite ignore, despite his best efforts at maintaining strategic detachment. Everyone who'd chosen to work with him had done so specifically because he acknowledged the horror of his calculations while executing them anyway, had valued his willingness to make terrible choices while questioning whether they were necessary rather than pretending institutional authority justified violence automatically, had recognized that holding competence and conscience simultaneously required permanent uncertainty about whether the mathematics actually justified their costs, and had chosen to engage with that framework because the alternative was either paralysis or brutality disguised as efficiency. The work mattered specifically because it acknowledged its own inadequacy while still attempting function. On the final day before his deadline, Kadrick found himself at Theorem's stable, checking on the mare who'd survived despite injury that should have proven fatal. The horse had recovered surprisingly well, carrying weight again, though not at the capacity she'd possessed before the accident. She'd adapted to limitations without apparent regret or self-recrimination, simply accepting reduced capability as new baseline and continuing to function within revised parameters. Maybe there was something to learn from that. Accept damage as permanent condition rather than temporary state before returning to previous capacity. Adjust expectations to match actual capability instead of mourning the loss of what had been possible before circumstances changed fundamentally. Survive by acknowledging limitations and building frameworks that function despite them, rather than pretending the damage didn't exist or waiting for restoration that might never arrive. Kadrick drafted his final response to Seraphine that night, words emerging with clarity that came from acceptance rather than confidence. The letter was brief, characteristic honesty about what he could offer and what he needed in exchange, but with addition that felt simultaneously like surrender and breakthrough. He accepted her framework with modifications that preserved operational independence within coordination structure. He acknowledged oversight as necessary verification that prevented catastrophic judgment failures his recent history demonstrated. He committed to building something sustainable rather than maintaining ideological purity about governance beyond institutional authority. And he admitted with honesty that felt like removing armor he'd worn so long it had fused with skin, that he didn't know if this choice was correct or just convenient, that he would spend remaining years questioning whether cooperation served the work or just proved his independence had been elaborate performance rather than principled stance. That uncertainty was permanent condition he accepted as cost of attempting to function with competence and conscience simultaneously. He sent the letter south with fastest messenger available, then waited for response that would determine whether his framework could survive contact with civilization or only functioned in isolation. The answer arrived 2 weeks later in form of Seraphine herself, traveling north with small retinue and enough documentation to establish formal governance structure that made Kadrick's operations legally recognized rather than merely tolerated. She rode into the settlement cluster with characteristic competence, dismounting before her escort had fully stopped and moving directly toward Kadrick with purpose that suggested this wasn't social visit or ceremonial formality. "You look terrible." Her assessment was delivered with clinical precision that somehow felt like concern beneath professional detachment. "Thinner than I remember, more scars than seems reasonable for someone operating in administrative capacity, and carrying yourself like you're expecting assassination attempt from every direction simultaneously." Accurate observation. Kadrick managed something resembling smile, though in my defense, recent experience suggests paranoia about internal betrayal is justified rather than pathological. Seraphine's expression softened fractionally, something almost like sympathy crossing her features before professional composure reasserted itself. "Walk with me." She gestured toward the settlement perimeter, choosing direction that provided privacy without isolation. "We need to discuss actual implementation rather than just theoretical frameworks." They moved through cold afternoon light, breath visible in air that promised snow within days. Seraphine walked with same controlled grace he remembered from years before, when their engagement had been political arrangement rather than personal choice, and neither had quite understood what they were building toward. "The Crown officials I've been coordinating with want verification that you're actually functional, rather than psychologically damaged beyond reliable operation." Her tone was conversational, but the content was knife work. "They've received concerning reports about your tendency toward philosophical crisis that interferes with tactical decision-making. Those reports are accurate." Kedrick saw no benefit in defensive justification. "I question whether my calculations are necessary or just sophisticated self-deception, approximately constantly." Apparently that's concerning to people who prefer leaders with comfortable certainty about their own judgment. It's concerning to people who need reliable coordination rather than volatile genius who might collapse into existential paralysis during operational crisis. Seraphine's correction was gentle. "But I've convinced them that questioning your framework is feature rather than bug. Uncomfortable reminder that calculation alone is insufficient for decisions that matter beyond pure tactical outcome." She paused at the settlement boundary, looking out across terrain that stretched toward mountains and wilderness beyond. "I'm not here just to establish formal governance structure. I'm here to verify that you're actually capable of sustaining this work rather than building elaborate framework that will consume you through accumulated weight of choices you can't quite justify to yourself." "And what's your assessment?" Kedrick asked. Seraphine turned to face him directly, gray eyes that had witnessed kingdoms fall and houses rebuild studying him with attention that cataloged every detail. "You're damaged, uncertain, and carrying psychological weight that would crush most people attempting your particular combination of competence and conscience. Also more functional than anyone I've encountered at holding contradictions without resolving them through comfortable certainty or paralyzed inaction." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell travel dust and leather, and something else that reminded him of years before, when possibilities had seemed less complicated. "The work needs people who acknowledge their own inadequacy while still attempting function, who question whether violence is necessary while executing it with terrible efficiency, who understand that surviving matters but refuse to optimize purely for self-preservation at others' expense. You're catastrophically bad at that balance, Kedrick, but you're still attempting it, which makes you more valuable than the alternatives currently available." Is that professional assessment or personal opinion? The question emerged before he could stop it. "Both." Seraphine's smile was complicated. "I rebuilt House Corvath through strategic calculation and political maneuvering that would horrify anyone who examined the methodology too closely. I understand what it costs to make terrible choices while questioning whether they're necessary. And I understand that finding people who share that burden is rare enough to be worth protecting, even when they're fundamentally unreliable." She pulled documentation from her satchel, formal papers that established governance framework with legal precision. "This makes your northern operations officially recognized, provides resources and authority, and establishes oversight that prevents the catastrophic failures your judgment is vulnerable to. Sign it, and you're no longer exiled Duke operating beyond legitimate authority. You're Crown Coordinator for disputed territories, position that carries both power and accountability. And if I can't sustain that position, if the psychological damage makes me unreliable despite best intentions, then the framework includes provisions for transition to alternative leadership without destroying everything you've built." Seraphine's honesty was brutal and necessary. "This is an arrangement that depends on your permanent competence. It's system designed to survive individual failure, yours included." She extended the documents with expression that suggested this moment carried weight beyond simple contractual agreement. "Choose engagement, Kedrick. Choose building something that acknowledges damage and limitation while still attempting function. Choose survival that matters beyond pure strategic calculation." He took the papers with hands that had steadied through acceptance, reading provisions with systematic attention before signing with precision that made the commitment feel simultaneously formal and intimate. The moment felt less like triumph than recognition of permanent condition he was choosing to inhabit. Not redemption or transformation, just conscious decision to continue functioning despite accumulating evidence that his framework consumed. everyone who trusted it while questioning whether that consumption was necessary or just familiar. The formal governance establishment took 3 days, paperwork and coordination that made Kaedric's operations legally recognized within Crown Authority structure. Seraphine worked with systematic efficiency, building frameworks that preserved his operational independence while establishing oversight that would hopefully prevent the catastrophic failures recent history demonstrated. But beneath the professional coordination ran current of something more complex, recognition between two people who'd chosen similar paths through different circumstances and understood the cost without needing to articulate it explicitly. On the final evening before her departure south, Seraphine found him reviewing defensive positions that had been maintained despite formal peace with Valdris, paranoia about future threats overriding comfortable assumptions about stability. You're still preparing for catastrophic failure. Her observation was delivered without judgment. Building everything to survive your own inadequacy or elimination. Seems prudent given recent track record. Kaedric continued his inspection with mechanical attention. Leaders who assume their continued competence create vulnerable systems that collapse when circumstances inevitably reveal their limitations. That's tactically sound and emotionally exhausting. Seraphine moved to stand beside him, both of them looking out across fortifications that represented months of work and accumulated sacrifice. You can't spend entire life preparing for your own failure, Kaedric. At some point, you have to accept that surviving is choice you're making rather than temporary state before inevitable collapse. Don't know if I can make that distinction honestly. The admission emerged more raw than intended. Every time I've chosen to trust my judgment, people have died or been betrayed or consumed by calculations that proved inadequate despite technical correctness. How do I distinguish between surviving because the work matters and surviving because I can't quite bring myself to stop even when evidence suggests I should? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment before responding, her own voice carrying weight that suggested she'd asked herself similar questions without finding comfortable answers. You don't distinguish cleanly. You just keep making choices and hoping the pattern adds up to something beyond elaborate self-deception. Some days you believe the work matters enough to justify its costs. Other days you think you're just a sophisticated monster who's learned to perform conscience while executing violence with terrible efficiency. She turned to face him directly, expression carrying something fierce beneath professional composure. I've watched you burn cities and save families, exile yourself, and rebuild operations, question every choice while executing them with ruthless precision. Wasm. You're not monster pretending humanity or saint performing necessary evil. You're just damaged person attempting to function honestly in spaces where power demands terrible choices. That's what makes you valuable, Kaedric. Not the competence alone, but the willingness to hold competence and horror simultaneously without resolving the contradiction through comfortable certainty. And that's sustainable long-term? Living in permanent uncertainty about whether my framework is functional or just sophisticated self-destruction? No. Seraphine's honesty was brutal. It's exhausting and unreliable and will probably consume you eventually through accumulated weight of choices you can't quite justify. But it's more honest than the alternatives. And honesty about power's requirements is rare enough to be worth protecting even when it's fundamentally unsustainable. The silence between them stretched into something comfortable, despite the weight of acknowledged limitations and uncertain futures. Come back south eventually. Seraphine's voice had softened fractionally. When you've established stable governance here and trained people who can maintain it without your continued presence. The capital has problems that require your particular combination of tactical brilliance and philosophical crisis. You're recruiting me for operations I haven't even heard about yet. I'm ensuring you survive long enough to be useful for coordination that extends beyond northern territories. Her smile was complicated. Also ensuring you don't disappear into wilderness when the weight becomes unbearable and self-destruction starts looking like tactical efficiency. She left the next morning with her retinue, formal farewells that masked the actual significance of frameworks they'd established and choices they'd both made about how to function in spaces where power demanded terrible calculations. Kaedric watched her departure with recognition that something had shifted, not redemption or transformation, but acceptance of permanent condition he'd chosen to inhabit rather than escape through isolation or surrender. The months that followed established pattern that would define his remaining years. Building coordination networks that acknowledged betrayal and required verification. Making terrible choices while questioning whether they were necessary. Surviving through combination of tactical brilliance and expensive mercy that never quite resolved into comfortable certainty. Jace developed into a remarkable operator, the kid's youth not preventing accurate strategic assessment and willingness to question authority that served operational security better than blind obedience. Kira expanded the settlement coordination into governance framework that provided stability without requiring crown resources that weren't arriving. Vale and Marcus built defensive capabilities that prevented future threats, while maintaining protocols that detected internal compromise. The work continued, problems solved through violence calculated precisely enough to call it strategy, while acknowledging the horror it inflicted. And Kaedric held the center, damaged leader whose primary qualification was willingness to make choices while questioning whether they served necessity or just familiar patterns of efficient brutality. 2 years after accepting Seraphine's framework, he received a letter that shifted everything again, sealed correspondence bearing royal stamps that suggested this wasn't routine coordination. The crown was facing crisis in the eastern provinces, organized rebellion that combined military competence with popular support in ways that made simple suppression tactically unsound and politically catastrophic. They needed someone who understood both strategic necessity and the importance of minimizing casualties even when mathematics suggested overwhelming force. They needed Duke Kaedric Thornheart, whose exile had been formally revoked pending his acceptance of command position that would restore title and authority in exchange for solving problems no one else wanted to acknowledge existed. Kaedric read the offer 3 times, processing implications with tactical mind that couldn't quite stop calculating whether this was opportunity or trap, redemption or just return to institutional authority that had exiled him for excessive honesty about governance requirements. He assembled his core coordination group, people whose judgment he'd learned to value through demonstrated competence rather than assumed loyalty, and presented the situation with characteristic honesty about limitations. Crown is offering restoration and command authority in exchange for solving rebellion that requires both military competence and political sensitivity. It's a remarkable opportunity that addresses everything exile was supposed to punish. Also potentially elaborate setup designed to eliminate me through circumstances that provide crown deniability about my death. What do you want to do? Kira's question was direct. Beyond tactical assessment of risks and opportunities, what does your actual judgment suggest? Kaedric thought about the question with systematic attention, trying to separate strategic calculation from personal desire, and finding the distinction impossible to make cleanly. I want to believe that competence combined with conscience can function within institutional authority rather than only beyond its boundaries. Want to prove that exile wasn't necessary consequence of honest engagement with power's requirements. Want to demonstrate that terrible choices can be made within legitimate frameworks if the people making them acknowledge the horror rather than hiding behind comfortable justifications. He paused, recognizing the actual truth beneath strategic language. But I don't know if that belief is accurate or just damaged egos need to be proven right about assumptions that got me exiled in the first place. Don't know if accepting crown authority serves the work or just demonstrates I can't function without institutional validation I've spent years claiming was unnecessary. Then maybe the answer is accepting you'll never know with certainty. Jace's observation was delivered with confidence that came from years of learning under leadership that questioned itself constantly. Maybe you make the choice based on what serves people who will be affected by rebellion's continuation rather than what preserves your ideological consistency. The kid was right, and Kaedric felt something settle into place that had been shifting since the morning the gallows collapsed and given him time to choose what kind of person he'd become. He accepted the crown's offer with modifications that preserved the frameworks he'd developed in the north, stipulations that required acknowledging civilian casualties, and questioning whether force was necessary rather than just efficient. The negotiations took weeks, legal precision that made his return feel simultaneously like vindication and surrender. The journey south was a strange reversal of his exile, traveling roads he'd fled along years before, when the kingdom had decided his honesty about power was more threatening than his competence was valuable. The landscape hadn't changed, but his relationship to it had transformed completely. Exile returned as something he couldn't quite define without feeling like he was lying about fundamental nature. The capital appeared on the horizon with familiar towers and walls, marble architecture that had witnessed his rise and fall in apparent restoration, buildings that didn't care about human drama except as backdrop for their own endurance. Seraphine met him at the gates with formal reception that masked personal recognition, crown officials arranging ceremony that felt simultaneously too elaborate and insufficient for what his return actually represented. "Welcome back, Duke Thornheart." Her voice carried layers of meaning that only he would fully understand. The kingdom has need of your particular capabilities, flawed and damaged though they may be. Delighted to serve. Kedrick's response was equally layered, though I reserve the right to continue questioning whether that service is necessary or just sophisticated performance of competence that disguises fundamental inadequacy. The ceremony proceeded with official precision, restoration of title and authority that made his exile seem like temporary interruption rather than catastrophic judgment about his fitness for leadership. Nobles who'd voted for his execution now welcomed him with political smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Military commanders who'd condemned his tactics now requested strategic consultation on problems they couldn't solve through conventional approaches. The rehabilitation was complete and entirely hollow. Surface acceptance that ignored the actual questions about whether institutional authority made terrible choices legitimate or just provided comfortable distance from their execution. But beneath the ceremony and political performance, something genuine emerged. Recognition among people who'd also discovered that competence required holding contradictions without comfortable resolution. Officers who'd made terrible choices and questioned them afterward. Administrators who'd calculated acceptable casualties and lost sleep over the mathematics. Leaders who'd survived by acknowledging that power demanded horror while refusing to pretend that acknowledgement justified the violence. A network of damaged people attempting to function honestly in spaces where civilization required violence, organized efficiently enough that everyone could pretend it wasn't violence at all. Kedrick found himself at the center of that network, not through formal authority, but through demonstrated willingness to make choices while questioning whether they were necessary rather than just convenient. The Eastern Rebellion proved exactly as complicated as Crown intelligence suggested. Military competence combined with legitimate grievances that made simple suppression morally catastrophic even when tactically sound. Kedrick spent months developing an approach that addressed underlying causes while preventing escalation into full civil war, framework that combined strategic pressure with political reform in ways that made everyone uncomfortable but produced actual stability. The solution wasn't elegant or decisive, just functional acknowledgement that some problems couldn't be solved through force alone and required accepting messy compromise that satisfied no one completely but prevented worse outcomes. The kind of terrible choice that defined Kedrick's entire framework. Calculation that served collective interest while leaving everyone involved questioning whether a different approach might have produced better results. 5 years after his restoration, Kedrick found himself in the palace gardens his mother had maintained decades before. Roses that had been replanted after her death, now blooming with same expensive beauty that served no tactical purpose beyond proving humans cared about things beyond pure efficiency. Seraphine found him there, settling beside him with comfortable familiarity that had developed through years of coordination and shared understanding about power's requirements. "You're contemplating flowers again." Her observation was gentle. That's either philosophical breakthrough or warning sign of impending psychological collapse. Both probably. Kedrick studied the roses with attention that tried to understand what his mother had seen in their maintenance. "I've been thinking about the question you asked years ago. Whether I'm building something that matters or just performing competence to disguise fundamental inadequacy. And what conclusion have you reached? That the question itself is the answer." He looked at her directly, recognizing the person who'd understood his framework better than anyone else attempting similar work. That permanent uncertainty about whether my choices are correct prevents the comfortable certainty that transforms necessary evil into casual brutality. That holding contradictions without resolving them is the actual work rather than temporary state before achieving clarity. That's remarkably healthy self-awareness. Seraphine's smile was complicated. Also suggests you've finally accepted that surviving isn't just strategic calculation, but conscious choice that matters beyond operational function. "I'm learning." Kedrick returned his attention to the roses, their blooms perfect, despite requiring constant care and resources that could be allocated more efficiently. Learning that beauty and meaning don't require optimization to matter. That expensive, impractical commitments prove humans are more than the violence we inflict in civilization's name. He paused, feeling something settle into place that had been shifting since exile began. "I burned Ravenholm and saved 16 families. Got exiled and rebuilt operations that prevented invasion. Questioned every choice while executing them with terrible efficiency. Spent years wondering if that pattern was competence combined with conscience or just sophisticated self-deception that let me sleep slightly better. And now, Now I accept that I'll never know with certainty, that the mathematics are always incomplete, and the horror remains regardless of justification. That surviving requires choosing to continue despite accumulating evidence that my framework consumes everyone who trusts it. Seraphine reached out, placing her hand over his with gesture that acknowledged shared burden and mutual understanding. You're not monster pretending humanity or saint performing necessary evil, Cadric. You're just damaged person who chose to keep functioning honestly in spaces where power demands terrible choices. That's rare enough to be worth protecting and common enough that you're not alone in the burden. They sat together in the garden as afternoon light shifted toward evening. Two people who'd survived by acknowledging that redemption wasn't forgiveness or transformation, but continuing to function. While questioning whether the work actually mattered beyond their psychological need to believe competence justified its costs. The roses bloomed around them, expensive impractical beauty maintained through resources that could be allocated more efficiently. Perfect example of what his mother had tried to teach him about meaning that transcended calculation. And somewhere in that garden between past and present, between exile and restoration, between mathematics and meaning, Duke Cadric Thornheart understood with absolute clarity that he would spend remaining years making terrible choices while questioning whether they were necessary, would hold competence and conscience simultaneously without comfortable resolution, acknowledge horror while executing violence with terrible efficiency, survive through combination of ruthless calculation and expensive mercy that never quite justified itself beyond serving as alternative to worse options, would be exactly what good people became when competent enough to survive their own principles, what the tribunal had feared and what civilization needed despite the discomfort his honesty produced, would remain fundamentally flawed, psychologically damaged, and catastrophically prone to judgment failures that consumed people who trusted him, and would continue anyway, because stopping meant accepting that the contradictions couldn't be held by anyone attempting honest engagement with power's demands, and that acceptance would transform every terrible choice he'd made into pure atrocity rather than necessary evil executed by someone who'd at least tried to minimize the cost. The garden settled into evening quiet, flowers closing against approaching darkness. The city beyond continuing its eternal function through violence, organized efficiently enough that everyone could maintain comfortable fictions about civilization's foundation. Cadric stood eventually, Seraphine rising with him, both of them moving toward the obligations that defined their continued existence and the choices that would determine whether their framework served something beyond elaborate justification for doing what came naturally to people trained in efficient brutality. The work continued, the questions remained, and the roses bloomed regardless of whether anyone understood the lesson they were supposed to teach about beauty that transcended tactical value and meaning that didn't require optimization to matter. That was enough, it had to be, because the alternative was surrender to comfortable certainty or paralyzed inaction, and neither option served the problems that would continue existing regardless of whether Cadric Thornheart chose to engage with them honestly or disappear into wilderness with his damage and uncertainty intact. So he chose engagement, conscious decision renewed with each terrible choice, and questioned with each accumulated consequence, permanent condition of attempting to function with competence and conscience simultaneously in spaces where power demanded calculations that reduced humans to variables in equations that never quite justified their costs. Chose survival that mattered beyond pure strategic value, framework that acknowledged its own inadequacy while still attempting function, life defined by holding contradictions without comfortable resolution. Chose, finally and irrevocably, to be exactly what he'd become through exile and restoration and everything between. Someone who made terrible choices while questioning whether they were necessary. Someone who calculated with ruthless precision while acknowledging the horror. Someone who survived not through certainty or transformation, but through accepting that permanent uncertainty was the cost of remaining human while engaging with violence as profession. Someone who would spend remaining days wondering if the mathematics actually justified their terrible costs, and choosing to continue anyway, because the alternative was abandoning work that mattered to people who'd never developed the competence or stomach for its execution. That was Duke Cadric Thornheart's final lesson, learned through accumulated sacrifice and questioned until his last breath. The understanding that redemption wasn't forgiveness or transformation, but conscious choice to keep functioning, despite damage that never fully healed and uncertainty that never resolved into comfortable answers. And in the garden, where his mother had once tended roses that served no tactical purpose beyond proving humans cared about expensive, impractical beauty, that lesson felt simultaneously like surrender and breakthrough. The only honest answer to questions that had defined his entire journey from institutional authority through exile to restoration that acknowledged both his value and his fundamental unreliability. The roses would bloom again next spring. The work would continue demanding terrible choices, and Kadrick would face them both with the same combination of tactical brilliance and philosophical crisis that had defined every decision since the morning the gallows collapsed and given him time to choose what kind of person he'd become when forced beyond the boundaries of comfortable certainty. It was enough. It had to be. Because nothing else was possible for someone attempting to hold competence and conscience simultaneously in spaces where power demanded mathematics that never quite justified their costs but had to be calculated anyway by people willing to bear the weight of their execution. And that was how Duke Kadrick Thornhart's story ended, not with triumph or tragedy, but with acceptance of permanent condition he'd chosen to inhabit. Damaged leader whose primary qualification was willingness to question his own judgment while still attempting function in service of work that mattered beyond his psychological need to believe it did. The mathematics continued, the roses bloomed, and somewhere between calculation and meaning, between exile and restoration, between violence and beauty, one man found peace not through resolution, but through accepting that the contradictions would never resolve and that choosing to continue, despite them, was the only honest answer available to anyone attempting to remain human while engaging with power's terrible demands.